Welcome to the Messenger's AI Balancing Innovation and Regulation Summit. Please welcome Jimmy Finkelstein, founder and CEO of the Messenger.
Good morning. As you've just heard, I'm Jimmy Finkelstein, founder of the Messenger. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank our AI partner, Seeker, and thank our very, very distinguished faculty. AI may be the most important single subject before the government in our entire lifetime. The creators of AI tell us publicly and privately that we're looking at the equivalent of a nuclear bomb. After private presentations at powerful tech companies, some of us in the media, when we were there, have been warned as we leave how dangerous AI will be. I laugh, it's not funny, when a reporter asks me about what the effect of the media will be, and it is important, but such a minor part of the issue. However, even on media, AI on social media is already reaping false narratives. There are so many issues that are important today, but government does nothing. When hacking can be used by individual people across the world to take down our power plants and electric plants, the government is slow to react. Think about how slowly the government responds to the dangers of TikTok. And that is when both political parties agree on a bipartisan basis that the Chinese-owned TikTok is extremely dangerous. But both parties actually use it, and regulation in government has come to a complete halt. Imagine how an unregulated AI will be, and how quickly we must come together to act. In Europe, right now, they're just trying to come up with regulations, and they're falling flat, and they're way ahead of us. So yes, AI can help cure diseases in ways we cannot imagine, but AI can also create targeted diseases. AI will essentially do away with the little privacy we have, and what happens ultimately when AI truly surpasses human intelligence without any ethical considerations. Our tech companies hire people from around the world in an unregulated way and working on AI, and then they go back to their other countries to compete with us. So we're at a crossroads. We need to compete, but the dangers are great. It is up to all of us in government, corporations, science, and media to meet these challenges. The Messenger was created to be a large and balanced site. We look to do our part. We all need to do our part because it is a very challenging and dangerous area. I want to thank you for being here, and we hope you enjoy the program. Thank you very much.
We will kick things off this morning with a discussion on cybersecurity and deterring emerging threats in AI. Please welcome Dr. Kathleen Fisher, Director of the Information Innovation Office for DARPA. Joining her is Eric Geller, Senior Cybersecurity Reporter at the Messenger.
All right, thank you all for joining us. Good to see everyone here. Before we get started, a few housekeeping things. First, we encourage you to sign up for our newsletter, The Morning Messenger. You can start your day off with everything you need to know about all the news from technology and business to politics and sports. I'm told that there are QR codes scattered around the venue, and I've been assured that they're safe. As a cybersecurity reporter, I'm not going to tell you to just scan any random QR code, but in fact, these are safe, we promise. So if you'd like to sign up, you can scan that and do so. We also hope that you've had a chance to check out the Seed AI exhibit in the back of the room, or will be able to do so later. You can play around and create some AI artwork, and we're grateful to them for bringing that to the summit today. And then two final things. First, you probably guessed I was going to say this. Please silence your cell phones. And if you would like to tweet or X about the summit today, you can use the hashtag MessengerAI. Okay, let's get on with the show. Dr. Fisher, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it. I want to start with a project that DARPA announced in August, the AI Cyber Challenge. And this is essentially a prize competition to find ways to use AI to locate vulnerabilities in our software before hackers can exploit them. Can you talk a little bit about why that's so important right now as we see AI start to take off in numerous ways?
Yeah, so one of the motivations for the project was Avril Haine's testimony to Congress in February of last year, where she testified that in the event that China were to decide to invade Taiwan, that they would likely carry out destructive cyber attacks against US civilian infrastructure, and that they likely had the capability of carrying out such destructive cyber attacks. So that would mean that in that conflict, it wouldn't be overseas, the conflict would actually be here in the US, and that like what happened with the Colonial Pipeline attack would be just the beginning of how that cyber attack would feel to US civilians. And that's the motivation for why it would be really important to dramatically increase the resiliency of our cyber infrastructure. And our cyber infrastructure runs on tons of open source software, like something like 80 or 90% of our code is in fact open source software. And most of that open source software has vulnerabilities that can be exploited. And so how can we rapidly find and fix those vulnerabilities? AI offers promising technology to be able to do that. Roughly 6 months ago, a paper came out that showed that ChatGPT could find and fix a number of those vulnerabilities. Roughly the same quality, it was roughly equal in ability to bespoke tools that had been written for exactly that purpose. But the most common answer that ChatGPT gave was, I need more information. But the really cool thing about ChatGPT is it talks English, right? It talks human native form. So you could actually have a conversation with it and give it more information. And when you gave it more information, it could then find more vulnerabilities. So that was one of the impetuses for starting this program.
There are, of course, a lot of hype around how we can use AI to improve cybersecurity, but can you just give us maybe a few concrete examples of what you're already seeing the federal government do or look into doing with AI? CISA, for example, is trying to use, that's the cybersecurity agency here in the US, they're trying to use AI to get their arms around all the data that they have about cyber threats and then generate essentially recommendations for how their analysts can act on that information, cutting out a little bit of that work that a human doesn't necessarily have to do. What are some of the other ways maybe that we could see AI help the defenders, not just the attackers?
Yeah, so one of the things that DARPA is doing is, so DARPA's mission is detecting and creating strategic surprise, so looking kind of way over the horizon. And one of the things we're doing is the CASTLE program, which is about using reinforcement learning to actively defend a system while it's being attacked. So the normal thing is when you find a system is being attacked, you take the system down, you disconnect it, you clean it up of the adversary code, and then you put it back up again. The problem is that while you're doing that, your system is not available. So the adversary has basically succeeded in doing a denial of service attack against your system. So the premise of the guard system is, can we create a cyber defender that is able to actively defend a system while it's being attacked, that it can respond that it can predict and know what the attacker might be doing and take active action to defend against that attack. So it can model what the attacker is doing, and it can say, okay, well, the attacker is going to likely pivot to using a particular service and cut off access to that particular service while preserving what the defender needs to be able to do. Like the defender is going to need to be able to continue to, use email. So it can continue to protect the email service or whatever that specific system is going to be using. So that's one way we're actively working on using AI to actively defend systems.
And then what about the other side of things, which is AI-powered cyber attacks? I reported recently that experts think AI is going to make phishing just a heck of a lot worse because it's going to be so much easier to write messages that don't have those classic typos that you've all been trained to look for, and it's going to be much harder to find these messages as the propensity for clever messages gets better. What is DARPA seeing when it comes to the ways that AI is helping the adversaries?
Yeah, so I saw a report last week that phishing attacks have gone up by like 1,000% in the last year because of exactly the context that you've seen. So I think to solve that is going to require a combination of technical work and policy work and education, so that we get even better at not clicking on random links or not following random QR codes. I think that a lot of that's going to require an educational effort. I think the same thing with manipulated media, right? The way of dealing with like AI systems are just going to get really, really good at generating fake images, fake video, fake audio, right? The number of people who have been already subject to fake audio attacks of somebody that they love has been kidnapped and please pay a ransom is really high. So like I think having a conversation with your loved people about like, if you get such a call, have a conversation about like, what did you do? Like, where did you get a summer camp last year or whatever, so that you're not, because when you're terrorized, you don't think clearly. So plan in advance, which is a sad state of affairs that we already have to think about things like that. But so DARPA has the Semaphore program, which is about being able to detect such manipulated media. So advancing the state of the art so that it's a cat and mouse game of the technology to detect and the technology to create. So keeping the technology to detect as far, at close to the frontier or ahead of the frontier as possible, but also having to work with lawmakers and policy people to put in watermarks and so that the people who create that technology can sign it and can sign the watermark so that you know that this is actually authentic, and regulations all at the same time. So I think we're going to need to have a combination of technology people and policy people and regulation and law people and civil society all working together to solve this problem, because there's no easy answer here.
One of the things that's really interesting about the AI space is you have this really just a handful of companies that are capable of developing these really powerful systems, the most powerful systems. And they're businesses. And so they're not necessarily, we've certainly seen in the history of technology, companies don't always put the public good ahead of profits when it comes to designing very complex systems.
It's not their job.
Not their job. They have responsibilities to their shareholders. Are you confident that this new segment of this relatively new segment of the tech industry is actually going to put the public good first, given the power of these systems? Or do we also have to be concerned about that profit motive perhaps crowding out some of the safety concerns in this industry?
I think you can be sure that every organization is going to operate in that organization's best interest. That's what organizations do. The public sector's job is to operate in the best interest of the public sector. Checks and balances are a super important thing to keep in mind. It's the founding principle of our country. So we need to have the public sector and the private sector work together. DARPA's mission is detecting and creating strategic surprise, and so our job is to make sure that we have technical solutions for policymakers to have at their disposal, so that we have the technical tools for policymakers to have at their disposal to help in that in the policy arena, so they're not blindsided and that they have tools to help in that conversation going forward.
Does the concentration of the industry, though, create any security risks? Because certainly our adversaries know who the major companies are. They're not impenetrable. We've certainly seen examples, including recently in the news, of foreign spy agencies playing the long game in terms of trying to get information from this country. And these are some of the companies that are going to have the most power in determining what the future of this industry looks like. Does that concern you, the concentration of the industry?
The concentration certainly creates risks. In terms of like foreign spying, it also creates opportunity or makes it easier in that we can protect a smaller number of companies more easily than we can protect a larger number of companies in terms of espionage. The technology is also diffusing out of the relatively small number of companies relatively fast, right? We see the frontier models that have capabilities that far outstrip the open source models, but there are like open source models coming out relatively fast that have capabilities that are a year or two behind the frontier models. So it'll be interesting to see what happens as the frontier models continue to advance. How much of a moat is there, which is a really interesting question for those frontier models, given the staggering resources that have been required to create those frontier models.
We are going to take some questions in just a minute. So if you've got questions, start thinking about that. But before we get to that, how do we regulate this space? I mean, DARPA's not a regulator, so you're not the person who's going to be in charge of that, but is the government even capable of getting its arms around all the ways that AI is currently being used, will be used in the next few years, and then methodically going through all those different industries and setting rules for how you can use this? Is that even feasible in the next few years as something that we could see?
Yeah, so DARPA doesn't do regulation, right? That's a government function. I think we see in social media the challenges of regulation. I think Bad regulation clearly would be a disaster, but no regulation might also be a disaster. I think it's a place where to regulate well, it requires a partnership between policymakers and lawmakers and civil society and technical people, and we need to get all those different groups talking together. I've definitely been really encouraged by the fact that lawmakers have been spending a lot of time talking to all of those different constituencies and really investing in being informed, right? Senator Schumer arranged for senators to have really deep conversations with policymakers, with technical people and civil society people, and really, in closed door sessions where they weren't posturing, but they were actually talking to and getting questions answered. Senators and other other lawmakers went to Stanford and got a deep technical dive. That's just scratching the surface, but I was encouraged by the level of education that lawmakers were willing to spend their very, very, very precious time. I think that kind of partnership is really necessary to work towards regulation that has a chance of helping rather than hurting.
Okay, I did promise a question and answer period, and I think we've potentially got time for maybe one question. So we do have a microphone runner, so they're going to be coming out in a second. So I guess just raise your hand, and they will come to you. Yeah, right here.
Hey, thanks so much, Eric. Marian Back from Inside AI Policy. So you mentioned the use of ChatGPT for cyber defense, and reading through the extensive executive order on AI, I do believe that there was a call for the government to create their own large language models, I think, for the use of cyber defense. So how has your work positioned you or DARPA or others to meet that executive order instruction, and where are you at with that?
Sure. So I think that was a reference to the AICC challenge, which is coming up. So that's a partnership with OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, and Microsoft. The semifinals will be at Black Hat next August, and the finals will be at Black Hat the year after. And the goal is to use AI and other foundation models to automatically find and fix vulnerabilities in software. And the idea is that those large language models can work at speed and scale to find and fix vulnerabilities basically across massive amounts of open source software. And we're partnering with the Open Source Software Foundation, which is the group that is responsible for blessing patches to open source software to get them in to the open source code, so that we would have a pipeline to really, really quickly find and fix vulnerabilities that could then be distributed across the massive amount of open source software that is used across many infrastructure software across the United States. So the hope is that the companies, the frontier model companies that we're partnering, will be providing access to their frontier models to teams that qualify with sufficiently good technology. So we're not training our own models. We are leveraging the state-of-the-art models and the advances that will be coming just as part of the normal development process to those models from OpenAI, Anthropic, Microsoft, and Google.
I think, unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you so much, Dr. Fisher. This was a great conversation, and please enjoy the rest of the summit. Thank you so much.
Representative Jay Obernolte of California is vice chair of the AI caucus and a former video game developer. Congressman Obernolte is joined by the Messenger's technology reporter Ben Powers.
Well, Congressman, first off, thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely, it's always fun.
Absolutely. And so just as a reminder to our audience, you can engage with our summit and everything else under the hashtag #TheMessengerAI, whether that be on Twitter, now known as X, or LinkedIn. But we're here to talk about sort of the AI learning curve. And so to begin, how do you think Congress is doing in that regard? ChatGPT has been out for over a year now, and there's been conversations, convening sessions going on. And so how do you think your colleagues are grappling with the technology, thinking about it, and really getting up to speed with something that's advancing rapidly?
Well, I think it's definitely a tale of two cities. On the one hand, I think Congress has done a very good job in acquainting themselves with the technology and spinning up a knowledge base about it and developing a well of knowledge in certain members in both chambers of the legislature. On the other hand, we don't have very much tangible work product as a result of that yet, and I think we're a little bit behind when it comes to crafting a regulatory framework that's going to be appropriate for the governance of AI. So there's a lot of work to be done there.
Mm-hmm. And I know Representative Eshoo has decided not to run again for Congress, obviously.
That's too bad. She's wonderful. Yeah.
Exactly. And so are you worried that as there is turnover in Congress, there could be a bit of a brain drain, in a sense, of the work that's gone into understanding this technology, Eshoo being one example?
Well, I think if we worried about turnover in Congress, none of us would get out of bed in the morning. But it's a shame that Anna is leaving. She's been a wonderful member, certainly very technically knowledgeable. But we have lots of different corners of Congress that have people with a very meaningful experience, and so I have no doubts whatsoever that we're going to have a team of people that are not only deeply knowledgeable but also strongly motivated to help us solve this challenge.
Certainly. We'll have your co-chair of the AI caucus, Representative Beyer, here later today to also discuss this. And something I'm thinking about in terms of education, right? Certainly Congress is trying to get up to speed. It's not just on you all, though. The public is also trying to understand AI better, as well as private industry. But some companies, in conversations I've had, reporting I've done, are really kind of integrating with AI as fast as they can. And that can come with, upside, but also risks. Without sort of that tangible progress that you're speaking about in terms of regulation, do you think it's wise for companies to really go, 100% full speed ahead when it comes to AI, or should they take a minute, just take a beat and be a bit more cautious?
Well, I think in a way, the fact that frontier models require such an enormous investment in capital to spin up right now is helping, because it means that companies are very cautious. When you have that much financial investment at stake, you want to make sure that you're going to get a return on that investment. And the way that you do that is you make sure that you're deploying the technology in a way that's not going to create liability for you. And I think that that's why you've seen companies be appropriately cautious in the way that they deploy the technology. And I think that one thing that's become abundantly clear is that AI is, on the one hand, seemingly miraculous, but on the other hand, very fallible, just the way that human judgment is fallible. When you look at things like hallucinations, which is something, if we had been talking about this 2 years ago and we used the word hallucination, you wouldn't think about it in the context of the output of a computer algorithm. But here we are talking about the AI's propensity to kind of make things up on the fly. So I think everyone is aware of this now, which is a very healthy thing, because as we build decision-making processes around AI, I think you're not going to see any big company take the bold step of saying we're going to empower AI without any human input. People are saying, okay, for very important decisions, AI can create an opinion, can create a recommendation, but it's always a human that is involved in ultimately making the decision. And I think that's appropriate.
Yeah. When I think of AI, I think of it more as a funhouse mirror reflection of ourselves rather than something all-powerful, as we often see reported in the news. And you just spoke a bit about the companies that are developing large language models, LLMs, and the foundational models, so the ones that plug into APIs, do other things, and interact with other companies. There's only a few companies that, as you mentioned, have the capital to do that. We have OpenAI, we have Anthropic, we have others. Are you worried that in some cases there's too few companies developing this, particularly when we see Google, Microsoft, really entrenched industry players lining up behind and giving billions of dollars in funding to just a number of startups?
Very much so. And I'd like to, if I can, hijack your question and expand it, not just companies that I'm worried about. I'm worried about the context in which cutting-edge research into artificial intelligence is performed. So we have a rich tradition here in the United States of doing much of our basic science research and development in academic institutions. And the reason why that's important is because it comes along with a lot of transparency. There's There's publication where, if you've discovered something earth-shaking, you publish and you say, look what I found. And then there's peer review where people at other academic institutions fact check you and double check your work and make sure that what you've discovered is actually what you think you discovered. That can't occur if it's all done behind closed doors. And we're in danger of becoming a society where cutting-edge research into artificial intelligence is done only in private, only by private companies, and I think that's very unhealthy. So that's why me and a number of my other colleagues are pushing for what we call NAIR, the National AI Research Resource, where we create a pool of compute and training data sets, and we make that available to academic institutions to make sure that a lot of that research continues to be done in academia and continues to be transparent.
And I think that's really important because a lot of the data sets that are used to train these LLMs are not standardized. They're really kind of more black box than they are open and transparent. And I'm wondering if you're thinking about that both in the academic sense, but also in the ones that the government might develop and work in coordination with academics to make those more transparent to everybody across the industry, just so we can better understand how these models are being fed because of, again, hallucinations, bias, other areas like that.
Right. No, I think you're absolutely right about that. But I also have a concern about the size of the training data set, because if you look at this latest generation of foundational models, it's become clear that this breakthrough that's happened, this transition from something that is human-like but still clearly machine to something that might actually one day pass the Turing test and convince people that it's a human instead of a machine. That transition has been fueled by an order of magnitude greater size of training data. I mean, in some cases, most of the public-facing content of the internet. So if you would imagine being a researcher in an academic institution, how on earth do you get access to something so broad? It's its own little kind of mountain to climb. So we want to make sure that kind of resource is available to people that want to use it.
And I will say, in collaboration and coordination and whatnot around this engagement process, right, getting input on regulations, doing that educational work, both for members of Congress and everybody else, I've heard concerns from smaller AI companies. I've heard concerns from some academics that they don't feel as engaged in this regard because so much of the current regulatory conversation has, again, been driven by the bigger players, which is a natural starting point given their advanced engagement and funding. But I'd be curious about what you had to say to smaller companies, people that are maybe feeling a bit on the outside of that regulatory engagement.
Oh, well, I would say engage. We certainly have reached out to them. It's, we on the task force have been engaged not only with the big corporate players in the AI space, but we're interested in talking to the broad spectrum of stakeholders here. So we've been talking to academics, we've been talking to technologists, futurists, ethicists. In particular, I am a big believer in seeking out people that disagree with me. I want to understand their thinking, and I want to see what it is in their worldview that maybe has escaped me as I look at the way that I view this technological landscape. So if there is someone out there watching who feels that way, I would say, please come talk to me, talk to the task force. We have an open door policy. We would love to talk to you and get your input.
Mm-hmm. And you spoke earlier a bit about the lack of maybe material progress regarding legislation that we've seen. But in the last 6 months, is there anything that's been introduced? And certainly there's been a lot of things introduced that really stands out to you as though you being above the rest.
Oh, of course. Our bill. The Create AI Act, is one of the, I think that's, as I look at what I think needs to be accomplished to create a regulatory framework for AI, I am a big believer in incrementalism. I think it would be foolish to believe that we could come up with a single, AI act that completely addresses everything, solves the problem, sails through both chambers of Congress and is signed by the president. I think that that's a fool's errand. But that means that we'll have to be incremental, and I think that that's appropriate because there are things that are very clear that are hazards that need to be mitigated now. And I think we understand enough about those to be able to craft legislation around them. But there are also things that are addressing more midterm and distant threats that are really a little blurry and not in focus right now. And I think that it's okay to wait and make sure we understand what those threats are and how to mitigate them before we craft that legislation. So I believe that the task of regulating AI is not something that's going to be a month long or a year long. I think this is going to be several decades of 5, 10 bills a year out of Congress to address various issues, and then taken together, that will be the regulatory framework.
And so long term, it's murky. I totally understand that. But quickly before we turn to questions, what's top of mind for concern for you in that murky future when it comes to long term? Because I think even people that are familiar with AI, and certainly you come from a technology background yourself, so you're more familiar, it's advanced more rapidly than I think a lot of people expected, even in the last year.
Sure. Well, I think that in my mind, there are 3 things that are near-term threats that we absolutely have to make decisions on soon. The first of those is how to mitigate against AI's ability to pierce through digital data privacy and re-aggregate data that's supposed to be disaggregated and use that to create behavioral models to influence people's behavior. That's something I worry about. And it's something that AI can do now. So I think that Congress has to finish the work that we've started in crafting a unified federal digital data privacy standard. And that's something that I know Energy and Commerce we've been working on that this year. I'm hopeful that in the next few months we'll see the reintroduction of some legislation that can get through both chambers of Congress. And then there are 2 decisions that we have to make, I think, very soon. And one of them is Congress's approach to AI regulation going to be? Are we going to follow the European Union, where we spin up a brand new bureaucracy and we require anyone using AI in anything but a low-risk setting to apply for a license to use it from that agency? Or do we follow what other countries like the UK are doing and take a sectoral approach, because the risks of AI are so contextual, to say that AI could be risky in one context and not in another. So do we empower our existing sectoral regulators like the FDA to take the lead there? And that's something that we're at a fork of the road. We can do one or we can do the other. We can't do both. So we have to decide about that. And then the second thing is we have to decide, is this something that the federal government does, or is this something that we empower states to experiment in? And I think we've seen in the digital data privacy realm the hazards of allowing states to preempt what is clearly a federal prerogative of regulating interstate commerce, which digital data privacy is clearly interstate commerce. I think AI is pretty clearly interstate commerce in a lot of contexts. So, I think that we need to make clear to the states, look, here are the guardrails, and outside of these guardrails, you can regulate, but inside these guardrails, this is reserved for the federal government, and I think that needs to be done soon.
And I want to jump in. I think we have one question. We asked our audience to send in video questions as well, and I believe we have one now from research analyst Ava Kelly.
Hi, my name is Ava Kelly, and my question is, what aspect of the Biden executive order surprised you the most? What did you find notable about the Biden executive order, and how, if at all, do you expect it to guide congressional policy priorities going forward? Thanks.
That's a great question. The executive order, I think in general is very helpful. If you read through it, it's clear that the White House and OSTP has done some very deep thinking on the impacts of AI on federal government and what federal government needs to do in response to AI. There's a lot of great stuff in there. There's also some things that I would consider overreach, and I know there's always this balance of power, this tension between the executive branch and the legislative branch, but there are things in there that certainly impinge on the legislative branch's prerogative to enact regulation. The ultimate source of regulatory authority is not the executive branch, it's the legislative branch. In particular, the invocation of the Defense Production Act, I think is very inappropriate. I don't think it would stand up to legal scrutiny. That's something that was supposed to be just in wartime, and for the administration to be attempting to use that to require companies to self-report their use of compute, for example, I think is and I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad idea. It's something that we're looking at as well. But the executive branch does not have the authority to do that. It has to come from Congress. So, but I don't want that to take away from, overall the fact that this is a good thing that they're doing deep thinking on this issue, and it's something that I hope we can partner with as we move forward in crafting, a mutual regulatory framework. Because ultimately, it's got to be a partnership. The legislative branch and the executive branch have to, working together, create this standard and enforce it.
Well, that's why we're having this conversation. Thank you so much,
Congressman. Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks, everyone.
Nicole Foster is the Director of Global AI, ML, and Canada Public Policy for Amazon Web Services. She is joined on stage by the Messenger's AI business reporter, Jackie Snow, for a conversation on balancing the speed of innovation with the need for AI regulation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Nicole, for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start with just hearing about right now how you think about balancing innovation with the need for regulation, where we find ourselves with AI today.
So, I mean, we certainly are not an unregulated industry, despite some of the discussion today. There is actually a lot of legislation or regulation that already does apply to a lot of the use cases where we see AI being deployed. So it's not entirely unregulated, although the discussions thus far would make you think so. And then in terms of innovation, I think there are lots of opportunities to regulate in a way that both protects the public and still allows for innovation to flourish.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about some of that regulation that you think can guide us right now that's already on the books?
Sure. So, well, I mean, whether it applies to healthcare or financial services, there are lots of existing legislation that organizations have to adapt to, whether or not it's a computer making the decision or a human making a decision. So those same rules and regulations still apply regardless of the technology in use. So those are still relevant. In other jurisdictions, there's, for example, strong privacy legislation that still applies, or biometric legislation that applies. So there is a lot of legislation that we have to comply to as we develop or deploy AI in different use cases.
Okay, so maybe some of this misperception about lack of regulation is because, and I come across this in my reporting, where we treat AI as if it's a completely separate thing, almost not even a technology. It's like a separate sphere of something we've created, but in reality, maybe it does sort of fit into some frameworks that we've already created.
Yeah, so I think the other way we sort of think about it, I mean, for AWS anyway, we've worked with companies or organizations in every sector of the economy and everywhere all over the world. And so when you realize just sort of the depth and breadth of this technology, it is very hard to regulate it kind of with one brush. And so before we even get to regulation, when we think about how we deploy responsibly, it is very use case specific. So the questions that you need to ask or risks that you need to manage are often very specific to your use case. And sometimes there are actually very, very low risk use cases where you probably don't need to regulate at all. So the challenge for legislators is to really kind of determine where these sort of things fall in the threshold of risk and make sure that we are focused on the areas where there is high risk and that we're paying attention to those areas. And I think if you want to be in an environment where innovation still flourishes, you maybe want to have a lighter touch in the areas where there's much less risk.
Okay. And so even granted that there is maybe a whole host of different types of risk for the use case, maybe overall, do you have thoughts about the concerns that some people are talking about when it comes to moving too quickly with this technology?
Well, moving too quickly, I think it's going at a pace that it is going. And I think it is truly a challenge to sort of adapt existing legislation, but also to come up with new legislation in a timely way. So obviously, there's a lot of discussion of the EqualAI Act, and that's an example where they've been really developing this very comprehensive piece of legislation over a large number of years, and they've done, I think, some very, very good work in terms of their analysis. But 3 years in, we also had the sort of advent of large language models, and they're now trying to, at the very 11th hour, adapt the technology or adapt the legislation to incorporate this new technology. So I think from a policy standpoint, we need to think about frameworks that can remain flexible to adapt to those things. So as an example, rather than creating a really strong rules-based system, some of the work being done in international standards organizations or even NIST here in the US, I think are some good examples to follow. So looking at governance practices and how we are managing risk and aligning ourselves to those standards to make sure that we're asking the right questions, I think is a great way to start. If you're trying to kind of create rules that are very strict and regimented, it's going to be very hard to adapt that to new technology as it emerges. And it could have the impact of either stifling innovation, or it could have the impact of completely regulating the wrong thing.
Speaking of some of these new large language models, you guys just announced Q, which is building off some of the large language models from, I think it's Anthropic, and that's the one that's coming to mind right now. But can you talk to me about how, like, what frameworks you guys were thinking about when launching this new AI tool?
So the AWS approach around large language models has really been about offering a lot of different choices in terms of different models. And what we've seen is that some models perform really well in certain use cases and less well in other use cases. So we have a service called Bedrock, which is sort of basically a menu option of being able to opt and try different models for your use case and adapt them to your business needs or your organizational needs. So our approach has really been about giving more choices of different types of models to our customers.
Okay. So I read in, let me get my notes right here. Platformer reported that Q is experiencing severe hallucinations and leaking confidential data. You are by no means the first company to deal with this, and you probably won't be the last. So I wonder if you can speak to how regulation maybe could impact large language models and some of these issues we see with them going forward.
Well, I think it is around testing your use case. So, and this falls into some of the risk management frameworks that already exist. So once you have deployed once you've sort of decided what your approach you're going to take or what technology you're going to use and how it applies to your business, you're going to want to test and audit that over time to make sure you're not, and there's a myriad of different things that you want to test for. So you want to test for drift, you want to test to ensure that the guardrails that you implemented are actually working, that the model is performing accurately for what you want it to do, and of course mitigate any potential harm that may arise from it.
Okay, and do you have any insight into, like, I know these are very early days, I think it was 3 days after it was launched that this came to light. Do you have any insight into where maybe the internal work that you guys did didn't catch these particular issues?
I'm not super familiar with that exact thing, but I mean, essentially what always happens is there's lots of internal kind of testing and experimentation, and then escalations that happen as a result of errors that take place. So that's why you'll see a lot of organizations sort of release things in a very sort of protected beta options. So they release things in preview for customers to try and work with their use case to see how it's going to perform, and then there's usually a series of improvements that need to take place as part of that experimentation, and then before anything is launched for general availability. That's generally the process, but there's always lots of nits along the way.
Sure. We have a couple minutes left. I have another question I'm going to ask, but if anyone has some questions, just think about it, and we have people with mics that can come to you. But I did want to ask one last thing. We have lawmakers here with us today, and I wanted to know, like, what would you like to see from Congress specifically in terms of regulation in the next year or so?
I think my two sort of recommendations are, well, three. First, make sure it's not already legislated. Second would be to take a risk-based approach to legislation so that we are really targeting the deployments that are most concerning and have the highest risk for the population. And then the third would be to make sure that that the regulatory frameworks that are developed here are interoperable around the world. So this is a technology that is a global technology, and we essentially kind of need to create norms that are going to be globally sustainable and interoperable around the world.
Great. Does anyone have any questions for Nicole? All right, I think we have mics.
Just wanted thank you. Just wanted to collect your thoughts. Would it make sense to have a self-regulation organization, so among the providers of this technology?
What it makes sense to have a what?
Self-regulatory organizations, such as FINRA for the security services.
Essential, yes. So it could. So there's a couple of different the EU has taken a very centralized approach to how it's regulating AI. And I think there's also a need to kind of think about very specific sectors where there's already strong amounts of regulation. So whether it's financial services or healthcare, it's probably more beneficial for a healthcare regulator to gain some knowledge around applications of AI in that sector, rather than trying to make an AI regulator an expert on healthcare. But at the end of that, you're probably going to want to have some sort of a backstop legislation to ensure that there are aspects of this that don't kind of fall through the cracks. And that backstop legislation should really sort of have the principles around managing risk and what are the approaches that we take to managing risk, as well as then testing and auditing.
Great. Well, that's all the time we had. Thank you so much, Nicole. I really appreciate you taking time to talk with us all today.
Thanks for having me.
Please welcome two tech industry professionals with a shared goal of building responsible, equitable AI. Austin Carson, founder and president of Seed AI, and Victoria S. Pinell, CEO of the Software Alliance. They are joined by the Messenger's AI business reporter, Jackie Snow.
Again, everyone. Austin, Victoria, thank you guys so much for being here and talking with us today. I have a question to start it off with both of you. I want to hear your thoughts on what you see are concrete steps that we can take right now to create more representation in AI. Maybe Victoria, you want to start?
So I think it starts with the companies that are building AI and making sure that their teams are diverse in every possible meaning of that word. And I think it's important for any kind of software that you're creating, or really any tool that you're creating, to have a broad range of perspectives. So AI is among those. Potentially even more important than others. But honestly, I would say I think AI, like any other tool, you need to have a broad range of perspectives, or it's not going to be as good as you want it to be. And that's true of everything that we do, including public policy here in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I would say from like a policy tool or like mechanism perspective, the NAIR, which is obviously so like weirdly fond, near and dear to my heart, that I decided to brand it, which thanks NSF for being cool with that. But it's the National AI Research Resource. It takes the core components that are necessary to create, develop, and test AI, and allows you to make them available to a broader universe of people by having a distributed network that has a single access point, much, much easier, and then it removes the barriers to participation. But that as a tool is meaningless without the work on the ground and the stuff in the communities to support that as well. So this National Science Foundation was founded on this idea of the missing millions, people all across the country that were left out as both like humans that have lives and would like to be I'd like to see benefited, and as a national asset, right? And so I think this stuff we're looking at today with the NAIR and Chips and Science are all actually in a lot of ways primed and ready to accomplish that goal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Victoria, maybe, as we're talking about it being like the technology companies, maybe you could talk a little bit more about like, what are those steps? Is it having like people going out and just
So, I mean, I think if one of your questions is how to reduce bias and discrimination in AI, which obviously is kind of one of the big focuses and important things, I would say a couple things. One, you said the tech companies. I actually think it's a issue that every company today should be thinking about very seriously, because whether you're developing AI or you're using AI, you need to ensure that there's not bias and discrimination to the extent possible. But the good news is there are real practical things that companies can do to reduce bias and discrimination. At BSA, we put out a framework, it's been over 2 years now, that sets out in a very detailed way a number of steps that companies can take. I'm going to mention just a few of them. One is monitoring on an ongoing basis, assessing and monitoring both the quality of the data that's being used, but also the outcomes that you're seeing, and having that be an ongoing basis. I think it's very important that companies be setting up governance bodies, and very important that those governance bodies spread across the organization as a whole and have layers of independent review. And CEO buy-in is very important. And I think that's how things happen in companies and organizations, is having, whether it's the president or the CEO, but having the top of the organization make clear that this is a priority, I think is critical.
Both of you have worked with policymakers for years, and I wanted to hear your perspectives on where they are right now in terms of understanding the moment we're in with the technology.
Yeah.
Do you go and I'll follow on.
All right.
Yeah.
I hate to go before you. It hurts me a little bit. So I think that this is a completely different world than with social media hearings. I mean, I think everybody remembers how just catastrophically embarrassing that was for everyone involved, and perhaps the country and history, I'm not sure, but catastrophically embarrassing, I'm sorry, everybody, Jesus. But I think this round, folks have learned that lesson to a large extent. So I do a lot of work with the Woodrow Wilson Science Technology Innovation Program's AI Lab, which has had I think maybe more than 1,000 congressional staff and executive staff come through and do a 6-week course that's 2 hours on a Friday, and you could not have paid me to do that when I was on the Hill. I honestly am staggered by it, and I love thinking about this stuff, And so I have noticed, especially as kind of the insight forums have rolled on and folks have started working on their own legislation, and I run back into those staff over the months, I mean, there's some very legitimately sophisticated ideas going on, and it's always hard to translate that to legislation, but I would say look at that as there are a few other initiatives like that we have partnered actually with BSA on in the past to bring in these experts and help educate, but that's not all that's happening. There's a lot behind the scenes, and I'm proud of them.
So I would agree with all of that. I've never seen anything like this level of interest and sincere desire to learn more. What I would add on to that is it's not just true in Washington. It is true everywhere around the world. It is true. It's been true for a little while in Europe. It's true in the UK. But it's, Japan has been working on its approach for many years. But in addition to that, Brazil, India, Japan, South Korea. I mean, we are working on this issue in every market where we operate around the world. And I've never seen anything like this. It's completely unprecedented in terms of having this many policymakers around the world focused on an issue at the same time, and I think genuinely interested in working with each other on a coordinated approach. I will also say that moment is not going to last forever. I think there's 6 to 12 months to seize that opportunity, but I think it's an enormous opportunity to have policymakers around the world so sincerely focused at this moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I want to echo that timeline. That's an extraordinarily important point.
The moment is now.
Yeah, speaking of that timeline, I know the AI Act in the EU is on shaky grounds as of right now, and if we are looking at a 6 to 12-month timeline, if it doesn't happen now, it maybe pushes out beyond this timeline where we're all focused on it. So I'd still like to hear your thoughts on that legislation as maybe the one that is, if it does pass, it is the next one on the docket to be passed, and what you guys think of that in terms of the policies across the world that we're seeing to help create frameworks around AI.
Mm-hmm. So they are in a process now, potentially the end of the process of having what they call their trilogue negotiations. And it is true that there are tricky issues, and those negotiations are not, they're complicated. I would still predict that they come to a solution at some point. I know they'd really hope to by the end of the year. Maybe it gets kicked out a little bit further, but I would bet that they do, and that the EU AI Act does pass And then there'll be a process where it gets implemented in the European member states over the next couple of years. But I think it will move forward. And I think directionally, what Europe has done, where they've taken what we call, others call a high-risk approach, is one that makes sense.
Yeah, I'll say, so a few things. The first is, this is one of the casualties of starting really early. Like I noticed we started Seed AI a couple years ago, and I started thinking about this in like 2016 or 2017. And the one thing even at the time, and I still see now, is like, we have no idea what's going on. Stuff is crazy. It's happening crazy fast in a way that anytime anybody's like, this is just like that, I want to slap them in the face. I'm like, guys, holy shit, no. This is nuts. You know what I mean? And so like I do give the EU credit for what they did in terms of like, well, let's at least look at the end point of this, since the technology itself is moving and kind of confusing. And I think as a general matter, that is good. Like the nature of the way their law works is kind of dicey for this. And there's a couple other things. I mean, the first is like their approach to open source, at least in my conversations, has been like a little wacky in the context of, I mentioned this to Dragos, like first of all, the open source like AI community and AI research has been one of the biggest drivers of innovation in the space, if not, obviously actually the largest driver in the space. The second thing is, if you should support it, but if you try to control it, you'll need like a global totalitarian police state. Bruce Schneier, just for encryption, printed out PGP and shipped it across the ocean. It's nuts to think you're gonna be able to stop this, and it's a bad idea. So like you should support the good uses and then mitigate any endpoint problems. But beyond that, I think like, to be honest, having participated in the Insight forums and having been part of that process, like I would be really pleased if the outcome of that happened before the EU AI Act. That would be killer, in my opinion.
I think the EU, as you said, like the EU started on this some time ago, and so they were fairly far down the road when ChatGPT was commercially launched, and then that has sort of put a little bit of a hiccup into the process as they're thinking about whether or not what they've done is fit for that or how it needs to be changed. So, it's complicated, the situation that they're in. But I would still stick to my prediction that they will come up with an assessment that will be the basis of a negotiation and move forward. And I would also predict that the next commission, so the whole European Commission government is essentially going to turn over next year. I would also bet this is going to be AI regulation is going to be high on the agenda for the next European Commission, and they're going to start another round of regulation on potentially another comprehensive bill or potentially on a few specific issues. Mm-hmm. But I think EU regulation on AI is not over.
Well, she knows like 100 times more about this process than I do, so definitely whatever you said.
Yeah, just maybe like an iteration process to like whatever, new models come out next year, the ones after, what they've learned from what they passed this time around, which maybe didn't take into account foundational models.
Right, or other issues that they didn't have time to adequately address that may not be specific to foundation models. Mm-hmm. It also gives the rest of the world a chance to watch what's happening in Europe and learn from it. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, and I wanted to follow up on that. So we're seeing engagement here in DC with like learning about the technology, but in terms of like getting things, laws written and discussed, like where do you think the U.S. is in terms of like creating some good regulations to start to consider in Congress?
Well, the U.S. is very, very active, right? And so I think, when people say legislation in the United States, their mind often goes to Congress for understandable reasons. And there is a lot of activity and education going on inside of Congress. But there also is, as you're well aware, the White House, the administration put out an executive order that has a lot in it. And then there's what's happening at the state level. And at the state level, legislation is moving. It is going into effect and enforce. So there's going to be legislation and regulation in the United States. At BSA, we think it would be helpful for Congress to be passing legislation. And we have detailed thoughts on what that should be. But legislation regulation in the United States is going to happen. The question is, does it happen in all three places at the same time? And how to try to keep that consistent or reasonably consistent.
Yeah, I'll say a couple things. First is, I do think that there's been meaningful progress. We don't have draft text out from the big deal in the Senate, but we have several different pieces of legislation. But to Victoria's point, the movement of the administration has been more significant than reported upon. The AI Bill of Rights was 72 pages, which messed with everybody. Everybody's expecting 10. And then the EO comes out and there are rumors that it was just gonna be general, I don't know, agencies try your best. And then it's 100 pages long. And it's substantive and it follows a lot of work that's happened in the background. So I think about it more and explain to folks it more like AI policy. than AI legislation, in the sense that we are having this emergent, which I think it should be and kind of is necessarily based upon the nature of the circumstances, but kind of emergent AI policy and regulations coming out of, I think what you can look at as almost like fertile ground or a dartboard, right? I mean, you look at the EO, there's like 100 deliverables that come out of it. Everything in the regulatory world kind of has that right now. So whatever can stand up, whatever works, we'll know to kind of make permanent, or at least semi-permanent, and then move forward on. But I think, to Victoria's point, I would look for pretty soon there to be action, and I would look for it to be like serious and substantive. And finally, the AI lab, it's been 50-50 executive and congressional. And so that shows you the interest. You got 500 folks on both sides that have cared enough to do a 6-week class on this thing, which may not sound like a lot, but y'all do not know how little time they have.
Just one more thought on the state level. BSA, we put out an assessment a couple of weeks ago of what's happening at the state level, and the amount of legislative activity this year compared to last year is up four times, 440% more activity at the state level than last year. And there were things going on last year too. So it's just an explosion of activity.
Mm-hmm. And do you see that, I know there's all these different levels and pieces of laws that are in different states of being discussed and passed, but are all, we're talking a lot about safety, but are there other concerns that you're seeing that are being addressed in there as well? Like we're technically on an equitable panel right now. Are we seeing that in there, or are there things that are getting left off as we worry about safety maybe more, or in competition more than other things?
Yeah, I think it is important to understand that this is like a gigantic all of society, all of humanity thing. Like there's a reason that there's kind of like an accelerationist, maybe this saves all of humanity, and an existential risk, maybe this kills all of us thing. Like it's not totally wacky. Like it comes from the fact that we are about to replace our technology layer with AI, right? I mean, it's been largely replaced by AI already, but the whole thing's gonna get there. Same reason it's not tech companies, it's all companies, right? So there are certainly things that are missing, but from like a structural standpoint, we're starting to fill in the gaps. I would say, to the question of bias and representation and inclusion, I was very pleased to see some of the provisions in the executive order that explicitly said, hey, prioritize people who haven't been able to be involved. Create these resources that need to be created, and put governance mechanisms in place, and try out different types of governance mechanisms to make sure that folks can actually be represented, have opportunity at the real level.
Right.
I'll tell you.
Truly participate.
Yeah, truly participate. I was gonna tell you, one of our key partners, his name is Tyrance Billingsley II, which kicks ass. And if I ever have a kid and want to name him after myself, it will definitely be the second and not Junior. Why did we do that? That was crazy. But anyways, Billingsley II, and he's, I remember we worked together a ton, and we recently had an event with him, Hack the Future Tulsa, which is building on our kind of idea of AI testing and training at the same time and bringing people in, right? And he said something that'll always stick with me, which was, what you do for me without me, you do to me. Right? And so as we went on and continued to work together, not only do we kind of try to let folks in different communities tell us what they want and how they want to accomplish it, but I chose to give him actual power over me, right? He's on my board for a reason, and not because I'm like, oh, I'm going to prove a point. It's my advisory board. Like, he can fire me, right? And there's a reason for it, because I trust him, right? I trust his ability to oversee me. And I think if we look at what needs to still be done in the federal government, it needs to be centering that as a concept. It needs to be saying, we're not here to be like, hey, you guys, we're going to try to help you do your best. Let people be in charge of their futures. Censor myself for you guys. That's kind of step one.
We had a question sent in. I'm wondering if we can play the audio of that for the panel.
Hi, I'm Christopher Coy, and I'm a policy staffer with Representative Summerlee, who represents Pennsylvania's 12th congressional district. I want to ask that how can we ensure that AI technologies don't further exploit Black and brown individuals for the profit of white male-dominated industries?
I'll just point backwards.
Yeah, okay. So, did you have any?
Right, I think it's a lot of the things that it's a great question. I think it's a lot of things we've been talking about. But I guess, here are one way to think about it. I think there are things that companies can do in terms of how they actually develop or use AI that are very important to try to avoid skewed outcomes. And then there is the participation in the actual process. And both of those things are important.
Yeah, I'll actually add something to that too, which is While I do respect that there will be times where technology was perhaps so powerful that we should keep it in some more secure area, which is also, I'm like, I don't know, the Nair, if we could build it, guys, please. But I do think that there's a real danger of like white dudes that look like me, who've been on the internet for too fucking long, sorry guys, that time, who are sitting here and saying, well, only we can be trusted with this. I mean, I'd love to let people that don't look like me participate, but only we. And the thing I do love about a lot of people in this nerd community is they know it too. A lot of them don't, a lot of them do, right? But if we try to keep everything behind a walled garden, and this is another one of my concerns with like not supporting and taking any dangerous action against open source, but in general, I think we need to get closer and closer to even the large corporations figuring out how to be comfortable with the idea of having people inside their walled garden in a limited, you know, like constructive, protect whatever the things Victoria says that I largely agree with, but I'll fight you on one just for fun, you know, thing that they can have, right? Because that's real. I mean, the AI Red Team that we did at DEF CON, where the companies put their own models in and let folks from Tyrants' organization, Black Tech Street and others actually try to break them, like that's a part of that, right? But that type of joint participation is critical.
Great. Well, we have time for maybe one question. All right. Can someone bring her a microphone over here? It's coming up behind you.
Okay. Hi, my name is Soribel. I worked for Senator Cassidy's office in the Senate. And I've been asking the same question to anyone who would hear me, and I never get a good answer. So maybe I'll get one this time, but no pressure. So with the executive order, we've seen an obsession with high school immigration, but not enough focus on cultivating our own talent, especially talent that is underrepresented, like, you know, just following up on what Austin said. And, you know, they always point me to NSF, and I have asked NSF itself, what are you doing? And they have like 100,000 little programs here and there. But what is a scalable, at scale thing that we're doing so that people from underrepresented backgrounds can, you know, take these jobs that are high paying, that are good, and not just, you know, people from two countries, China and India, who are the ones that get all the H-1Bs. So please, like, if anyone has anything, I would love that.
Yeah, since it is involved my favorite topic, I'll jump in, but I'll try to be brief, which is hard for me on this. But really, like the National AI Research Resource, as envisioned, right, as described in different congressional intent, and in a letter they sent to NSF about the AI Bill of Rights, like you cannot operationalize anything designed to protect people without having an environment for those people to participate and to test out the things that may in some way negatively impact people, right? So the first part is having a space that is equivalent in power to the private sector as much as we can, right? Where we can do this type of work and do it in a way that intentionally involves folks that haven't been involved. And here's the thing about like bringing people in. It isn't just making, like I was saying earlier, it's not just making a house and being like, go in there and play with all the super complicated tools, good job. And it's not like, hey, you know, we'll hold your hand and let you do the crappy part and like label some data, but you'll be in the same house. It's like, you know, you have to make a ladder up hand in hand with people, right? Working with different communities, because every community is different. And I'm talking about local, I'm talking about groups of people, I'm talking about everything. Like this is a like diffuse atomic type of operation that has to happen. And then at the same time, while being decentralized, you have to be able to put the essential components in a location, right? And then distribute them out in a rational way. So we actually have been working with the National Science Foundation to try to bring in community college students, which like anybody hating on community college students is an asshole because it's just everybody's people that are poor that are trying to better themselves, you know? And they're from every background, every age, right? And we're trying to get folks together from as many states as possible and then resource them so that they can build up the programs that they would like as they would prefer. We brought people from 20 states, flew people in to the AI Red Team at DEF CON, and we've expanded it to several more states since then, and we're putting together like curriculum and research support packages that we can then train different leaders to operate. And to your point, it's all gonna be about having 1,000 programs, which is why we're also working with them to try to build kind of and there's going to be a lot of this going on, right? Like a lot of people are going to be able to experiment and should experiment with this, right? There shouldn't be just me trying to make stuff up. It should be everybody. Like, I don't know what the hell I'm doing, but I'd like to help get other people that do involved, but build a platform to bring a lot of those tools, a lot of that curriculum, the access to those resources together, and then even do that in a way that's bespoken for a number of different communities. See what works, right? We're going to host it on Hugging Face. We'll have leaderboards, right? And we'll host it in a number of different places. It will be on every platform, whatever, and designed to be completely open. And it's that approach that I think is required, like leaving it open for self-determination, helping people make sure it's safe and they can do what they want to do, and then making it so that it's the exact same as what you would get if you went to some big company. As much as you can't, because we can't throw $1 trillion at investing stuff in the States. We're going to get as close as we can. And that's why I'm glad we're going to push for $2.6 billion for the NAIR. And maybe get 10% that. I'm we should do 10 times that. And that would still not be close to competitive. All right, sorry, I'm done with my huge rant.
Let me jump in with one thought. So you work for Senator Cassidy, is that what you said? Yes. So fantastic. First of all, just echo on the community colleges, it's so important. So my husband is from Louisiana. We have a house and a restaurant in Louisiana. You know firsthand how much innovation and creativity is in Louisiana, a state that people don't always think of it, but it is, there's so much tech that's happening there from a technology point of view. And the point that I wanted to make is I think there's a real opportunity in our country over the last few years that came out of the pandemic, which is the ability to decentralize the teams that are working on these and therefore spread out the benefits of jobs across the United States, get them out of the tech hubs into all parts of the United States. Obviously, there's a big training component there to make sure people have the skills, but there's an opportunity for jobs now across the United States in a way that there wasn't 4 or 5 years ago. And I think that is something that we're starting to see companies already embrace. Personally, any company I think that makes the wise decision to hire people out of Louisiana is going to see the benefits out of that. But you don't have to get people to leave Louisiana. Right now, we can hire people in Louisiana to do those jobs, and I think that's incredibly important.
Okay, great. Thank you for that wonderful question. And Victoria and Austin, thank you guys so much for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us. It's fun.
Miriam Vogel is the president and CEO of EqualAI and chair of the White House's National AI Advisory Committee. She is joined on stage by the Messenger's science and technology editor, David Ewalt.
So, Miriam, we're here talking about getting AI right, making it responsible. Well, I think we have to define that, right? Let's start with that.
Let's start with that.
What is responsible AI?
Thank you for that question. What a great place to start. What is this thing of which we speak and hope for? That's a really important place to start because we're throwing around these terms. We're moving quickly. We have to make sure we're aligned. I would argue, and what we've been saying for 5 years, is responsible AI is building trust with your AI systems, ensuring that you have systems in place to deserve that trust, that you have the frameworks, that you have the best practices, and then communicating to the broader ecosystem, to your employees, to your consumers, how you've gone about building that trust. It's a 3-part process. It's easier said than done because, as we know, we have a time right now where the framework, the landscape is not crystal clear. A lot of this is being decided as we go, but there are laws on the books that apply.
whether you're talking about AI-based decisions, human, or a combination of the both. We have a paper coming out imminently where we survey the laws that are currently on the books to give a sample of what is imperative that all companies understand, that they have it top of mind when they are building or deploying or licensing AI. But a lot of this comes down to what are you doing internally? It's about best practices.
Right. And so that is a long process, and we're really talking about getting our fingers into it from the initial development of the AI all the way out until it's deployed, and we're regulating its use. But maybe we should start with, well, where are we right now? Have we made progress? Are we in a good place? What do you feel about our current state of readiness for this?
Yes, we've made progress, but I would say we are at a critical juncture. I think we are at a moment when we can, if we continue at our current trajectory, not be in a good position, significantly increase the opportunity gap, significantly increase the variable, the delta between who is benefiting from AI, both economically and personally, and who is not. However, I think we are at this exciting moment where we have the opportunity to do better. We have the opportunity to use AI to help reach more people. We have AI that is now more accessible if we can make sure people use it and want to use it and are safe to use it. And if we're very thoughtful in some of the questions brought up in our last discussion, how do we make sure that the broader ecosystem, how do we make sure that AI is built by and for a broader cross-section of our community?
Okay, so let's start there. So I know that, first we start putting the AIs together. We've got companies developing them. You recently put together this white paper, and I know that you talked to a lot of corporations. There was a lot of different voices involved in putting this together. What were your takeaways about how different entities are putting together responsible AI and where we're getting started there?
Yeah, well, the good news is a lot of companies are thinking about what it means to be a responsible actor. And what's interesting is while we're talking about this being a time of unknowns, those who are giving deep intention and thought are often coming up with the same answers. The other thing that I think is interesting is being a good, responsible AI actor is not very different from being a good corporate citizen, a good, strong organization. A lot of the best practices are what you would expect of a corporation otherwise. There's one new important variable, and that's making sure that you have a framework in place to manage your AI system. But again, not a novel concept. We've done this in cybersecurity. We've done this in privacy. It's making sure you're being intentional about how you're going to approach your AI use, development, deployment within your organization. The good news is there. We have the NIST risk management framework and other great frameworks out there to build on. But the other piece is what we call good AI hygiene are really broadly being applied across companies that are giving thought to this.
How much are we hamstrung by the development process here in that when we look at, okay, this is a problem that we've created in the AI world, or this is something we need to regulate against, a lot of the examples of AI that we're working with right now came out of corporate research laboratories. That's what they were working on 2 years ago. So how do we make sure that what is being worked on right now, the next generation, is being created responsibly?
Such a great question, because by the time the law plays out, we're a few years away from now, and it's too late for what's being built now and yesterday. As we know, we've used AI how many times today alone? We can't wait for regulations in the future. The good news is there is a lot on the books. So I think we need to start with where are we currently with what is being regulated and accounted for in our current legal system. Again, hopefully our paper will be of some value there, but if significant value within the US, most every federal regulator has come out in the past year or two and explained these are laws within our purview that you need to be aware of. We saw the EEOC come out saying straight out of the bat that they had all of the civil rights purview within the HR and employment context. We saw joint historic statements that haven't happened before between the EEOC and the DOJ. And then following a year later, they also joined with the FTC and the CFPB. All the alphabet soups are coming together to put people on notice. What you are doing that is seemingly fine and safe, don't fall for the false premise, the implicit bias that because it's AI, it's neutral and scientific and thus right. It's right for the use case for which it was designed. It's right for the population on which it was tested. But you need to make sure you know the answer to who those and what that was.
Yeah, you touched on something there that we're waiting for. A lot of this is waiting to see how the courts play out on these issues. How do we regulate for responsibility when we're still waiting for the courts to rule on critical issues like what is copyright and how does it work with AI?
That's a very fair question. There's many laws on the books currently. We're all looking at regulation. I think we all need to be looking at the litigation space. Here we have hundreds, if not thousands, of judges and juries across the country that are going to help us decide how do AI and copyright come together. We're starting to see those cases play out, but as you know, litigation takes some time. That's where we try to step in with EqualAI and others as well to align on best practices. So we have to decide together how are we going to march forward at this time when there are some unknowns. And again, there's precedent out there. We know that for copyright, for instance, they've said a machine cannot have a copyrightable work, and they've confirmed that when you're talking about AI use. So we have some ground rules. We need to make sure we're clear on those, but we need to make sure that we have alignment opportunities for industry to learn from one another and to say, how have you interpreted this? What obstacles have you run into so that we can move forward?
So on the regulatory side, can you tell us a little bit about, well, let's start with your role on the National AI Advisory Committee. What is your role there? Like, what has come out of that office? What have your recommendations to the Biden administration been? What do we need to talk about next with them?
Well, thank you for that. Yes, so the National AI Advisory Committee, for those who are not familiar, was launched a year and a half ago, May of 22, so a little more than that. There's 26 advisors, 26 AI experts across industry, civil society, academia, who were all selected to advise on our congressional mandate, which is to advise the President and the White House on AI policy. So in our first year, we operated as a more traditional federal advisory committee. We assembled, we had our public meeting where we could deliberate and discuss. We had our year one report. Our year one report focused on areas specifically mandated in the statute: workforce, international collaboration, research and development, trustworthy AI, and so forth, competitiveness. And we laid out 14 objectives that we thought the president needed to focus on immediately, with 24 action items. Specifically, here's what you need to do now. They included things ranging from the NAIR that you just heard about. Absolutely need investment in NAIR. Obviously, that's not fully within the president's purview, but we suggested they support legislation in that space. The NIST risk management framework, something we doubled down on in our recommendations. We talked about its use across the federal government, as well as use in international collaborations to create alignment on this really important, impressive document that had already been put into the world based on a multi-stakeholder intense process. For year two, we realized AI is changing everything, and it's the downstream effects, including our own committee and how we needed to be operating. So we threw away the rule book. We now have public meetings pretty much monthly. Instead of waiting for an annual report, we knew April was going to be way too late. Anything we would have recommended by then would have been out of date months before. So now we're putting things out monthly. And on ai.gov/NIAC, I hope some of these resources will be of use to you. There's also many ways to provide input through email, through our public sessions. There's an explainer document, for instance, on the tools available to the federal government to act on AI policy. There's also an FAQ created by those companies that are part of our the people who are in companies working on generative AI, where they created and frequently asked questions on generative AI. What is it? What are the risks? How do you address it? So we're very hopeful that this steady cadence of deliverables can be more responsive to what you're asking for. So keep asking. Tell us what you need.
Well, and keep asking. I think you can ask right now, too. I think we have time for a quick question from the audience, if somebody has one. Or while we look for that, I can throw one out, another to you, too. So you just highlighted, there's 14 areas that the commission is looking at and all these action points, but that is an illustration of how much is happening right now and how much we need to do. Where is the urgency, and what do you think is the thing where, okay, right now we have to move on this first?
Well, I would define that to our purview. So our purview is the president and the White House. And I think the unique areas where we need to see a federal executive action is you'll see in our constant conversations, in our year one report and going forward, is, for instance, on workforce. We need to make sure that our workforce is AI ready, and it does not mean that everyone needs to be a computer scientist. It means that we need to have a workforce that is able to participate in the AI economy and benefit from the AI economy in all the ways, both personally from the AI use as well as economically. We need to make sure that in our education realm that we are creating a population that is able to thrive in this AI world. So those are areas where you've seen us mention. In addition, internal workforce within the government. We need to make sure that they're capable. And then a third area that we think that the federal government has unique purview, and that's an international collaboration. AI does not have boundaries, and so to some extent, while we're talking about federal regulations and litigation, it's a bit of a misnomer. We need to have our eye on the global landscape at the same time. It's not either or, it is both, and the federal government is in the unique position to make sure that we are having that important collaboration and discussion and alignment on AI.
So how do we, in the couple seconds we have left, we know there are members of Congress here today, there's a lot of people from congressional offices. If they're going to run back to the Hill right now, what is the message they should be taking to those elected officials and say, okay, this is what we need to start with?
From my personal hat at EqualAI, not my NIAC hat, I would say you are absolutely right to be getting steeped on AI policy in the way that you have over the past few months. Thank you for that. We need to make sure that those three critical areas are addressed today. How do we make sure that our democracy can continue to thrive? I believe a core piece of that is making sure that our population, our workforce, our people are AI ready, that they're able to participate, that they are safe to participate. And that's obviously a longer conversation, but an important one, because I do believe our democracy depends on it.
Well, I'm glad that we've gotten the conversation started today. Miriam, thank you for coming out. Thanks.
Here to discuss the technological transformation of our economy is President and CEO of Siemens USA, Barbara Humpton. The Messenger's AI business reporter, Jackie Snow, is back on stage to moderate this conversation.
Hello, everyone, and hi, Barbara. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm really excited to talk about this topic because I think when we talk about AI, a lot of it's very much like software focused, like helping software engineers or writing, but what you guys are doing with Siemens and the industrial use cases, I think we're going to start to see become a lot more prevalent. And I was hoping to start off with hearing you describe industrial AI and what that is currently.
Yeah, yes. Let's talk about the real world. Siemens, we're in our 176th year, and we're a company that has transformed the everyday for everyone, living at that edge where the real world meets the digital world. So if you think about industry and infrastructure, if you think about transportation, these are all real world things that today can be transformed via digital tools. And so what we've been working on is how to bring the really cool technology that's entered our lives in the Internet of People over the last few decades, now applying it to the Internet of Things, which is orders of magnitude bigger than the Internet of People. This is the front end of a really exciting time. So you may have seen in the news in the last couple of weeks, Siemens and Microsoft announced the Siemens Industrial Copilot, an AI-powered capability that really puts AI into the hands of people interacting with industrial machinery. Up until now, maybe one of the most useful tools and technologies in large-scale manufacturing was the bicycle. And you go, what? A bicycle? Yeah, because people had to actually get around a factory and program the controls everywhere across a production line. Now, with the combination of industrial AI giving us the ability to program more easily through natural language interfaces, and now bringing that to the edge with cloud-enabled devices, we can actually bring a whole revolution to the way we're managing the industrial floor.
Yeah, can you talk to me a little bit about what we're already seeing, beyond the bicycle with AI in some manufacturing settings?
Yeah, so think about a couple of trends that are happening right now in manufacturing. One is a very simple one, glocalization. Right? Glocalization. We used to feel like the way our supply chain ought to be tuned is to get to the lowest point of labor, find the lowest possible cost of supply, go to that single source, and then have that be our production point for the entire world. Then disruption hit. And so we now are asking ourselves the question, wait, could we actually distribute manufacturing? And the answer to that is yes. The second thing that's happening though, because we have this new capability, if you get beyond the bicycle and can now make your manufacturing floor more responsive, more agile, reprogrammable in the moment, you can go from mass production to mass customization. And that's the superpower of the future. When you and I get to decide, what is that thing we want? What do we want it to look like? And let's make lot size 1, my Grandma Barb shoes that I love to wear, that nobody else is gonna wanna wear.
Can you talk a little bit about where the American workforce is, in terms of reskilling or being prepared for the type of change that AI on the manufacturing floor will bring?
Yeah, so listen, I've heard a lot of people talk about, hey, Barb, tell us how Siemens sees the future. And I use this simple little phrase, it's more electric, it's more connected, it's more autonomous. And when I say autonomous, people go, doesn't that mean job destruction? And the practical answer is we don't have enough people to do the jobs that need to be done as it is. We need automation to elevate the role of people everywhere. Now, here's the really cool thing that's happening, and I love the question from Senator Cassidy's office. What do we have to do differently? And I've got 2 answers for you. One is all of these technologists who are talking, Siemens included, what we've got to do is democratize the technology that we're building. And one of the things we're focused on is how do we make all of our user interfaces more intuitive? How could the future of manufacturing feel more like playing a video game? And I tell parents all the time, let your kids play their video games, because this kind of user interface with technology is something that's going to be very helpful to us and is going to translate well into some very scientific fields. But there's something that would be incredible in terms of how do we get more people in from the sidelines, and how do we get companies actually participating in the workforce development that we need. Start thinking about investments in people the same way we think about investments in property, plant, and equipment, for Pete's sake. I love the work of the National Talent Collaborative. If we could get beneficial tax treatment for companies to invest in people and their reskilling, their retraining, man, that would change the dynamic overnight.
Slightly change the topic, but in terms of investing in people, when it comes to the U.S. and the global space of AI competitiveness, how are we doing? Are we, we got you guys helping us out, of course, but where overall, how are we doing in terms of being able to compete with other AI creators?
Well, we know that elsewhere in the world there have been huge investments in AI. We also know that what it takes to be successful in AI is incredible, huge investments. I mean, let's not underestimate the expense of training large models, of having the compute power available. All of that is necessary to advance here. What we've got in the US, though, is this incredible superpower of the private sector being on the commanding heights of the economy, right? This isn't being dictated by government regulation. Government is there enabling a business environment that allows innovators everywhere to step forward and go. That's cool. We also have the brainpower. We've got data. We have all of the ingredients we need. And one of the things I've been seeing just in overall economic trends that are taking place around the world, Siemens is working in 160, 190 countries that we've got a view into what's happening globally. And what you see in the US is this environment of relative health, relative energy security and low cost energy. And then, of course, all the brain power of the people who are here. We have all the ingredients it takes to have a leadership position.
I have another question, but if people have their own, maybe start to think about it, we'll have time for one or two questions. With all this new technology being deployed, it opens up, new attack surfaces. And I'm wondering how you think about introducing this new technology, but also being, cognizant that there's cyber threats, both known and unknown, that get added to the situation.
Yeah, and this is what I love about the dynamic conversation that's happening with government and industry today, because we recognize things are moving so fast, there's no way that government alone can keep up with it, and there's no way that industry alone is going to be able to solve the potential problems. So, let me bring this into both AI and cyber. On the AI front, what's interesting about being in the industrial AI space is that typically we're working with more constrained data sets. Things that are more controlled. This isn't open general language. This is very much, it can often be a customer's proprietary data. I like to say to people, instead of data lakes, we're talking data puddles, right? So I think we naturally are working to be in an environment where we can manage and control the effects of the work that we do. The second thing, though, I'll share is that we've long been believers in responsible tech. Years ago, Siemens created the Charter of Trust, partnering with other tech companies to come up with principles of cyber self-governance that we would propose that others sign on to. And that charter gives us 10 principles that keep us grounded in the practices that put us on the forefront of protecting the critical and precious infrastructure that we're part of. Now, I'll say one more thing, which is I was thrilled when the White House called several months ago and asked that Siemens join the NSTAC, the National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee. We've had the telecom sector and the IT sector well represented, and for the first time, operational technology has been invited to the table. So I'm proud to bring our voice into the dialogue, and again, to be a responsible citizen helping to drive the future direction.
Okay, great. Does anyone have any questions for Barbara?
There's a question here, what do you worry about, Barb? Right now, I'm worrying about keeping up. Some of you may know that Siemens actually delivers critical electrical products that enable data centers to function properly. And right now, data center expansion is exponential. That requires power from the grid. And the question is, do we have the capacity to make sure that Siemens is not the bottleneck in the expansion that we know is transforming our economy and is going to make everyone's lives better? I see a question from Senator Cassidy's office.
Yeah. Hi. You know who I am. So I see a lot of companies that, are putting out principles and frameworks and all of this for responsible AI. And it takes me back to, the trust and safety when social media companies were a little bit under pressure and they built trust and safety teams. But when things got a little ugly last year, all those teams were disbanded, and responsible AI teams right now are being disbanded and then hired back again. So what suggestions do you have to make sure that companies see this responsible AI function as a business imperative and not as a DEI or HR issue that will be the first one to go when things get a little ugly?
Great question.
Yeah, okay, so let's talk about bedrock. Right? There are a lot of people who are confused today about the principles that over the long term lead to strong business results. And I will tell you that Siemens is one of the companies, we've created a framework we call Degree that captures the essence of our framework on ethics and governance. It deals with sustainability. It deals with equity. Why do we talk about these things? We talk about them as the bedrock of business and the necessary foundation for future business success. I believe shareholders, as well as other stakeholders everywhere, can see that direct line from responsibility to profitability. And that is going to be the pressure. Those who are taking their eye off their ball right now because they're being pressured by something in society, whether it's the profitability race, it is possible to totally miss the play. And I fear that some of those companies are going to have a misstep and maybe won't be here to carry us into the future. Our intention is that Siemens will be here grounded in the principles that we know work over the long haul.
Great. Well, that is all our time. Barbara, thank you so much for being with us today.
Jackie, thank you.
Senator Todd Young of Indiana is a member of the Senate's bipartisan AI working group and is leading efforts in Congress to understand and regulate this rapidly evolving technology. Please welcome the Senator and the Messenger's technology reporter, Ben Powers.
Well, Senator, thank you so much for joining us. And
thanks for having me.
Dive right in. So I think when it comes to AI, China's obviously top of mind for a lot of different lawmakers in terms of the global competitive landscape, how we're addressing that and thinking about this both currently and then 10 years down the line. I hear a lot less discussion around other countries, maybe not adversarial. For example, thinking about the EU, thinking about Israel, India, who are also really heavily pursuing AI. Where do you think we stand in terms of that competitive landscape as well, in addition to China?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking that question, Ben, and thank you to the Messenger for holding this event. This is something I put some thought into, as my colleagues have naturally been focusing on what we might need to do legislatively, regulatorily, with respect to research in other areas on artificial intelligence this year and in coming years. I've been in parallel trying to think about how we can coordinate our activities with partners and allies and shape the global environment somewhat. Number one is research. There are real research collaboration opportunities between the United States and other countries, particularly partners and allies. We need to ensure that Indian nationals, Israeli nationals, European nationals, and many others feel comfortable in our universities and that we're collaborating. Then at the postdoc level, to the extent we're working on breakthrough, sort of cutting edge research, those activities need to be collaborative in nature as well. Much of this research occurs through our DOE labs and at the postdoc researcher level in our universities, and we can create more of those bilateral exchanges. Outside of research, which is just an obvious area for collaboration, we need to harmonize our regulatory environment after we act domestically, and perhaps with an eye to harmonizing our regulations as we pass our own laws, so that we can marry up our individual domestic efforts and set the rules of the road, as it were, for this next generation amazing technology that's going to transform all of our lives in very fundamental ways. If we do that, if we can establish the gauges to the railroad, so to speak, then when you have autocratic countries, China comes to mind, but it's not the only one, and they want to have their national champions developing AI for sometimes malign and nefarious purposes. If they want to achieve the sort of scale that's necessary to really drive down the costs of those technologies and reinvest in the success of those models, they're going to have to be able to sell into our markets and therefore they'll have to design their technologies consistent with our rules of the road. So this is, at once, it's a play for the betterment of humanity. It's a commercial play so that we can become richer and hopefully spread the benefits of that increased prosperity more evenly. But it's also a geopolitical play if we play our cards right.
And in thinking about that geopolitical aspect, how do you think AI plays in terms of, our national defense and other areas around security, both today and looking forward?
I think much is said naturally, understandably, about this topic. There's a lot of consternation, candidly, about our ability to increasingly automate important decisions that have life or death implications, trigger pulling decisions, whether you're talking about nuclear weapons or anything short of that. And those are really important conversations. I think at this point, our society certainly is not ready to automate many of these decisions. And so it's very important that we have transparency into the algorithms that will help us in an aided fashion make these types of decisions. Then, per the previous question, we'll try and create an environment. Perhaps it'll be global agreements, perhaps it'll be alliances of countries that'll come together and say, we share your values and we want to create some international norms against automating life or death decisions. But I would just emphasize there's a whole other side of artificial intelligence that can make us a lot more safe, a lot more secure. Can enhance our homeland security by monitoring anomalies in the environment that should concern us. It will allow our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines to make decentralized decisions and be aware of threats on the horizon. This will all work to the advantage of a country like the United States, which, at least at the moment, has the most advanced AI technologies in the world.
And something I think is important is also the role of AI in current conflict zones. Obviously, there's been reporting that Ukraine has used facial recognition during its current war. There's also been reporting that Israel has used, AI to generate targets in the Gaza Strip. What do you think is the role of AI in conflict? And do you think the ways it's being deployed now is kind of changing the rules about how we might think of using AI in the future?
There's a lot to unpack in that. Certainly. Excellent question. I think we're seeing it play out right now. I mean, Ukraine and perhaps Israel, but Ukraine certainly is a test case for the use of this new technology. And one of the interesting things we're finding out is AI provides new opportunities to use old weapons in interesting ways. So we've had drones around now for certainly a generation, and we're seeing the swarming of drones increasingly. That's something that has been talked about for a while, but we're actually seeing it in Ukraine. We have seen the ability of a Patriot battery, aided with artificial intelligence technology, take down a hypersonic weapon that the Russians were sending the Ukrainians' way. So we're applying older technologies, older platforms in new ways. I think that's really interesting. In terms of the rules, the rules are being established in part by the precedents that are established on the ground. And I think we will come up with judgment calls informed by our values in international and transnational forums about what we find offensive with respect to the use of AI in Ukraine and other places, and then we'll make efforts to disincentivize it or prohibit it. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And there are conversations around that happening. I think everybody's really wondering about how that may be used in this regard. Yeah. And so something I wanted to bring up too is, you introduced legislation that would establish an Office of Competition Analysis, really looking at the various, pros and cons and how we're stacking up against other arenas. Could you talk to me a little bit more about what that office would look like in practice?
Yeah, this is something that Senator Bennett and I thought important to put forward. It's essentially an office of net assessment, determining where the United States at any given moment in time stands vis-a-vis other countries, other adversaries as it relates to national security relevant technology. We would locate this, unlike the Office of Net Assessment, which is within DoD and kind of looks at the entire military posture of the United States against particular actors. This would be within the White House so that it can communicate with DoD, state, commerce, and other relevant committees, departments, and have kind of a whole of government look. But it would also be highly informative to and help direct policy making within the executive branch, but also in the legislative branch. What do we need to do different? Where are our adversaries stronger than us? What investments should we be making? What barriers should we be lowering? Who should we be collaborating with? On and on.
No, and I think that definitely amounts to areas from education to cybersecurity to just defense writ large, and how can we mitigate some of those threats? Well, at this moment, I don't think we have time for questions, unfortunately, but really appreciate you coming, and yeah, thanks again.
Ben, thanks so much. Yeah.
Turning our attention to the financial sector and the risks posed by AI, please welcome the chair of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, Gary Gensler. Joining him is the Messenger's Deputy Business and Finance Editor, Don Kopecky.
Hi, Gary. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's so good to be with you, Dawn.
Yeah, it's great. It's been.
For those in the audience, Dawn used to cover me when I was in the Obama administration, and so it's great to be back together.
The Clinton administration.
Well, I wasn't going to go back.
It's been, not to date each other, but it has been a while. Again, you can tweet about this with the hashtag #MessengerAI, the MessengerAI. And wanted to start with some of the comments. You've been looking at AI for a long time, even when you weren't in the administration. You've called it the most transformative technology of this generation. Tell us how exactly it's being used today in banking and finance in ways that as a banking customer or brokerage customer, I might be interfacing with AI and not even realize it.
Oh, thank you. I have said that. I got this opportunity about 6 years ago to go up to the small university in Cambridge, Massachusetts, MIT, and I was asked to come up. Just a small one.
Yeah.
I was asked to come up, and we were able to do that about the intersection of finance and technology. And I said, great, I'm glad to come up if I can come up full time, if I can teach, and if I could be around things broadly in technology. And AI then, 6 years ago, I thought was one of the most transformative things. Some people thought it was crypto. Right? I respect. You can have that debate if you wish. But to your question, artificial intelligence has been being used in finance already for years. Just think about this. If you take a check to an ATM and you put that check in, there's not a human on the other side reading it any longer. There's something called natural language processing, which has artificial intelligence. It's pattern recognition. Insurance companies are using it for claims processing. Big finance companies are using it to protect us, the public, in terms of whether there's credit card fraud and the like. They're using it for anti-money laundering compliance and the like. So there's a lot of processes that are already in place, and then you layer over it that investors, hedge funds, high-frequency trading shops, big investors are been using it as well to look for patterns.
So good things. But recently, CNN wrote a headline from March that read, AI can be racist, sexist, and creepy. And the father of our AI, Jeffrey Hinton, has warned that it has the potential to take over the world, that it has not the potential, but the very reality that it will at some point become self-aware. And just a few days ago, you told the Financial Times that it would be nearly unavoidable that AI would trigger a financial crisis in the next decade. And while you were at MIT, you speculated that there could be a financial crisis by 2027, just 4 years from now, or 2037, triggered by AI. So, not to go all Sarah Connor Terminator on you, but...
Didn't Linda Hamilton do a great job in that role? She really did.
But what are all the ways AI could go wrong in financial services? Some of the things you've been thinking about that keep you up at night?
I sleep really well at night, but I think of it on the micro level and the macro level. On the micro level, I think you're absolutely right that it can lead to bias, using AI to underwrite loans, insurance, and the like, because we as a society have biases in our society. It can come through the data. There's micro challenges about conflicts. We at the SEC put out a proposal this past summer with regard to the use of artificial intelligence and other covered technologies by robo-advisors, or you may call them investment advisors, and broker-dealers. So is there a conflict if you're optimizing for the investment advisor's interest ahead of your client? So these are important micro issues. But yes, I think there's some macro issues as well. And the macro issues is that there are natural economics that will lead to monocultures, that there'll be base data sets or base models. And large parts of the financial sector will be relying upon it.
Trading on it,
underwriting on it. Look, we've had a monoculture in FICO scores for decades. So this is not an unusual thing or novel thing, I'm saying. But if you take and you go from, and they were two data scientists, Fair and Isaac, who came out of Stanford 70 years ago, that led to the FICO scores. But if you take that and you put it into an AI model that's hard to explain, that may have biases, and many people are relying upon, you could see that you could have financial instability. If you have large parts of the market relying on one data set, on mortgage data, they could kind of, the herding effect drive us off of an inadvertent cliff.
Yeah, and they could, say, recommend trading a particular security based on where treasuries are, that everyone trades all at the same time, and then you have some sort of collapse of that security or market. Is that possible?
Yes.
Okay.
But see, right now, some of the folks in finance will say, listen, it's all fragmented and I'm not going to share my data. Why? I'm a big hedge fund or I'm a big bank. I'm not going to share my data with someone else. That generally happens early in a technology. But there are going to be data sets and there are going to be models. Just think of it this way. The various generative AI models, how many are there that you're talking about? If you want to think about it, how many big cloud providers are there? 3 dominant ones in the US. And so we're likely to end up, because of the network economics, 2, 3 of these dominant foundation or base models that largely everybody else is relying upon. It's a supply chain of AI, if you haven't thought about it. If you're a fintech startup, a community bank, a smaller asset manager, you can't build the big models. You've got to rely on somebody else's model.
You've got to buy it from someone else.
Well, it's the old, build versus rent.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of the things that SEC is doing right now to try to head off those things. You mentioned the regulation.
Well, I don't know if we can really head off. Let me say, on the micro level, we put out a proposal with regard to conflicts. We've gotten a lot of feedback. It's sort of straightforward concept. You've got to put your client's interest ahead of that of the firm, or are you putting in what's called the optimization function? Are you also optimizing on the investment advisor or broker-dealer.
Okay.
There's also about fraud. And let me just say, fraud is fraud. And there's a human that's using a model that's defrauding the public. That human, depending on the facts, is likely going to hear from us, right? It's the same thing there. But we are worried about faking the markets and fraud. On this macro issue, I think it's really needs a lot of discussion amongst not just financial regulators here, but around the globe.
Well, we're going to go to questions in a few minutes, so think of your questions. But when you talk about fraud, who do you prosecute? Let's say there's a rogue, creepy, sexist, racist AI that becomes self-aware and, I don't know, steals $8 billion from a crypto exchange or something like that, or steals money.
You got a lot packed in there.
Let's say there's a rogue AI. Who do you prosecute? Who do you charge as the SEC?
Well, artificial intelligence as we know it now still has humans in the loop. So, I don't know when we get to, Sarah Connor's days.
Yes.
But there's humans that are putting that AI model in place and setting what's called the hyper parameters.
Okay.
And so there are still humans that have responsibility for that AI
So the
model.
programmers behind it.
Well, I don't know if it's the programmer. I didn't say that. The human. So
Okay.
but I do think that you raise important points that will at some point play out in the courts.
Okay.
But I do think that there are still individuals, humans behind these things, at least for now.
Okay. Now, what's next for the SEC? What's on your regulatory wish list for regulating AI since it is the holidays? What would you like?
Look, we're going to sort through the public comments on this predictive data analytics proposal that we made. That's about the conflicts of investment advisors, broker-dealer. That comment file just period closed in October. But also I look forward in 2024 collaborating with other financial regulators here in the US and around the globe about these macro issues.
A working group? Is a working group in the works?
Well, already the Financial Stability Board, which is an international group of regulators, has put this on their agenda for 2024. And I don't want to front run anything that Secretary Yellen does who leads the Financial Stability Oversight Council. But this is something that we're talking about amongst regulators.
Actively. Okay. We have time for a question or two. We have a mic runner to go, how about over here?
I can hear you. Just speak up.
So it seems like a lot of small companies that are starting these days, they're talking about AI a lot, regardless of their actual AI capabilities. That's also the case with large companies. Is the SEC considering any enforcement action in terms of companies misrepresenting their AI capabilities or, how widely they're using AI?
Don't do it. I don't, one shouldn't greenwash and one shouldn't AI wash. I don't know how else to say it. If you're raising money from the public, if you're offering and selling securities, you come under the securities laws and give full, fair, and truthful disclosure. And then investors can decide. That's all I would say.
And you've already brought some enforcement actions already, I believe.
In terms of there are times in other spaces where people mislead the public, and it's the same set of basic law, but also the basic concept that you can sell a security, you can promote an opportunity, but fairly and accurately sort of describe the material risks.
Okay, one more question. How about here?
Hi, Chairman Gensler. Besides the conflicts proposed rule, are there any other specific initiatives that you're launching off the back of the executive order on AI? And how is the SEC structured internally? Do you feel like you're going to have the right people who can wrestle with sort of the technical aspects of AI as you move out on regulation?
The executive order didn't call for the Securities and Exchange Commission. We were not, specifically in there, but we are talking to our colleagues across the administration. I know the Commerce Department, for instance, has multiple things they're working on out of that, and the U.S. Department of Treasury and the like. In terms of the second, we've got a great staff at the SEC, 5,000 people. We use artificial intelligence already in some of our examination and enforcement and our economic work already. But in terms of policy, we talk to people using the technology, we talk to people in finance, market participants, and we put proposals out like we did on the predictive data analytics, and then we hear back from the public.
I think that's all we have time for. Thank you so much. Rep Beyer is going to be up next. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gary.
Thanks, Gary.
For a look at the path forward for AI legislation, please welcome Vice Chair of the AI Caucus and Representative for the State of Virginia, Congressman Don Beyer. The Messenger's technology reporter, Ben Powers, is back to lead this discussion.
Hey everybody, hope you're enjoying the conference. Just a quick reminder, if you want to engage with us on Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever you live your digital lives, you can do so under hashtag #TheMessengerAI. But more importantly, Congressman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Ben.
So let's dive right into it. In terms of AI legislation, what do you want to see passed, maybe in the next 6 months? What are your priorities? And what's your wish list in terms of AI legislation?
Well, in the short run, I think early on the House AI Caucus had agreed that we should try to find some incremental basic pieces of legislation, things that we could build on, things we wouldn't need to reverse a year from now or 5 years from now. So off the top of my head, one of the most important things we have is the Create AI Act, which we've done. All four chairs and co-chairs of the AI Caucus are co-sponsoring it. So it's 2 Dems, 2 Republicans. It's nice to actually work on the Hill on something that's pretty bipartisan. Including Jay Obernolte, who was here
exactly.
earlier
He mentioned the Create Act as well. It's a popular one.
It's a very good thing, which we're really excited about. And that's more about creating for the first time a national AI research resource through NIST, but larger than that. It reflects some of what's in the executive order. And it's the notion of, well, the simplest way for me to understand it is the GPT-4 scrubbed the internet of 6 trillion words. Right? But we know that 2 trillion of those 6 trillion words were wrong, right? Either they were evil or just factually incorrect. So the notion is if we're going to be using data sets, huge data sets to create models, let's make sure that the data sets are relatively curated so that they're trustworthy, that people can understand what's in them. So it's the notion of using the federal government and its resources, including the National Science Foundation, to create really big databases that the researchers, the academicians, the professors, et cetera, the technologists can use. Another one is, we had a lunch last week with Elizabeth Kelly, who I guess was one of the principal authors of the executive order, is looking at the things in the executive order, which I am very proud of and impressed by. All 127 pages if you print it out. That should be turned into legislation. One of the things we've been working on for a couple of months that's actually in the executive order is mandating that the federal government agencies, Department of Defense, Interior, Commerce, et cetera, when they contract with the private sector, and AI is part of that, is that insisting that the private sector, number one, obeys the NIST framework, which right now is the gold standard for what should be happening. And number two, that we ask, and the NIST framework is aspirational. It says you should do this, you should do that. We would like to see this. Is actually be prescriptive let me pick on one of my government, I've got Raytheon and Boeing and Northrop Grumman, that if they're doing major work for us and using AI, they should be the role models for the rest of the world in terms of integrity and all the issues that we talked about this morning.
Absolutely. And so I'll be talking with the director of NIST actually a bit later today. What's one question you think I should ask her?
How she does it with two people. That's the scary part, is you have this thing that we know is going to change all of our lives and the lives of generations to come. And I think there's literally 2 or 2.5 people at NIST right now that are responsible for this. So I think another major priority we should do, and I hope in a bipartisan way, at a time when we're slashing budgets, is put a lot more money into that particular unit at NIST.
I think there's a pretty good chance that might come up. Yep.
Okay, good, yeah.
And so, thinking about legislation moving forward, you talked about, Raytheon be a best practice in terms of engaging with AI, who's working with the government, how they can do it. There's a lack of transparency around a lot of private large language models, thinking OpenAI, Anthropic, others. Is there anything that Congress can do to help address that and kind of raise the black box?
Interesting you'd ask me that, because a bill we're about to drop is specifically on the foundational models. And our working definition of a foundational model is, you think GPT-4, but there'll be many others. There's somebody that has 100,000 inferences per month. Inference is going in, pulling out, or 30,000 signed up users in a month. So not everybody. There are lots of small uses of AI, but the big models should have. And what we're trying to do is, in the legislation, to say if it's a foundational model that much of AI is being based on, that we should know what data it's being trained on. B, we should know what are the securities in terms of privacy of information, the people looking into it. Not what the algorithms are itself. We don't want to share IP, but at least let people have insights into how the foundational model works. Mm-hmm. What are the bases of a neural network?
And that echoes a bit of the language, too, that's in the AI executive order that was released as well.
Right.
And so what would be the mechanism by which you would do that, and who would those details be reported to in the federal government?
The way we have it laid out right now is the FTC and NIST.
Okay.
And two different entities working together, because the challenges are going to be different. Yeah.
Okay.
And the FTC has an enforcement division, which NIST does not. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
They're not regulators, they're not enforcers.
Yes, that is absolutely the case. And so thinking about the coming, probably the most major topic of next year, do you think we'll see federal regulation in time for election season, given I think the interaction of AI in elections is something that's at the forefront of everybody's mind?
That's a really scary question. I'm optimistic, again, and by the way, I don't think any of this is going to happen by next Thursday.
That's fair.
When we're gone.
We all need sleep.
Yeah. And we have other things to do. I think the most interesting two pieces, one's by Richie Torres from New York, the other's by Yvette Clarke from New York, which are all about disclosure or in terms of use of AI in political ads, or even forbidding the use of AI in political ads. And that's the really frightening part, is seeing what's happening in other countries that don't have those kinds of regulations kicking in. We saw a picture earlier this year that Governor DeSantis used, I think, of President Trump and Dr. Fauci together, arm in arm, which was probably right on the border of an inappropriate use of AI. Mm-hmm. Right. So.
I have a quick follow-up to that. I believe just recently, the NRCC released a political ad that involved AI-generated images. Are there any plans for Democrats to engage in similar behavior when it comes to campaigns?
I hope not.
Okay.
None that I have, certainly. And I'm among the DCCC leadership on the House, and that I've known of no discussions to be using AI in that respect. Yeah.
Gotcha. Well, let me know if that changes.
Okay.
But otherwise, we asked our audience to send in questions. I think we have a repeat offender, research analyst Ava Kelly, with a question for us. How about we give her a look?
Hi, my name is Ava Kelly. My question is, to what extent do you believe regulation will be left to federal agencies, and which federal agencies do you expect to lead these efforts? Thanks.
That's a wonderful and oft-asked question about, should there be one new big agency that we do it, or do we leave it to the individuals? I don't know. My instinct is that we should leave it agency by agency, because the things that the Department of Defense are going to be looking at will be completely different than the things NASA is or Commerce is or the like. I'm also I am not a Milton Friedman fan, but I do believe that his suggestion that when you create a new federal agency, they're easy to create and impossible to get rid of, that we should be careful about building a new building and a new infrastructure and a new couple thousand employees, if we can do it in a distributed way. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we have just a couple of minutes left. Is there anybody in the audience with a question? I'll ask you to keep it tight.
Hi, I have a question about your master's that you're doing in AI. That's very interesting to me, and I'm sure it's interesting to other people. But in your opinion, what are some ways that we can bring more people into AI and kind of do like a tier way of doing things? So, for example, what can you do with an associate's? What can you do with a bachelor's? What can you do with a master's? For people that don't have the time or funds to go do a master's in AI, but they still can work in the area and they still can participate and benefit from, from those jobs. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah. Although I want to wander off with 8 different answers. Let me just say that I very much appreciate that most people don't have the time to go back to school. I'm now. I can't tell you how much time this gobbles up. I'm just finished. I have my final exam tomorrow on my Python 3 coding class, and it's astonishing. It's actually really fun. It must be probably the most interesting thing I've done this year is learning how to code at age 73. However, very few people are going to have that privilege to be able to do that. So what I hope is that we can put together short courses, things that you could do on YouTube or AI interactive, things where you can dive into it without having to become a coder, understand how neural networks work, how things are trained, how you can, how the new math works that allows you to just iterate all kinds of huge information to get meaningful answers. I took the first couple weeks of a AI course at Coursera from Stanford a couple of years ago. I got a 0 on the first exam. Which is why I decided to go back to school. But what I learned in the first 3 weeks about how mathematics has evolved right now, I think would be fascinating to almost all of us and give us a greater sense of how AI works and why it's important.
No, and I think that's a great place to finish this conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Ben, very much. Thank you. Good luck.
Here to discuss the impacts of AI on our democracy, privacy, and civil rights, please welcome Katie Harbath, CEO of Anchor Change, and Alexandra Reeve-Givens, President and CEO of the Center for Democracy and Technology, joined by David Ewalt, Science and Technology Editor at The Messenger.
So this is, I think, a particularly interesting topic right now because we're at this unprecedented moment where we've got an emerging technology that is doubtlessly going to change our democracy and the way we work. And it's emerging during a period of intense political change and a big election year. So let's set the stage before we get into the details of how that's going to work. When it comes to threats to democracy and AI, what are the horror stories? Let's put people straight up in their seats. Like, what do you worry about when you hear, okay, AI, this is what it's going to do to democracy? What's the worst case?
Well, I think that for me, the worst case at the moment is just the sheer number of elections happening next year and the number of areas and surface areas that this can unfold in a lot of different ways. So next year is an unprecedented number of elections where it's first time in the same year as a US presidential. You'll have elections in India, Indonesia, Taiwan, maybe Ukraine, Mexico, the United Kingdom, European Union. I'm tracking 83 elections across 78 countries right now. And so that's a lot of languages, a lot of just different places, and a lot of places where we might take our eye off the ball where foreign adversaries are going to be able to potentially use this technology to try to change how elections happen in those places.
And I very much agree. And one of the things that gets the most airtime is the risk of deepfakes, right? Manipulated images or audio that mislead people about what a particular candidate has said and done. That's hugely important and we should talk about it. But I also worry about how AI is going to make it so much easier to target people with specific messages in far more personalized ways than we've seen before. So in previous elections, we've seen voter interference campaigns done by text message, by email campaigns, sometimes quite generic language. It's the same with a scam. It's easier to tell that it's a fraud or manipulated image. But here, where you're able to generate content at speed and at scale for a very low cost, not only can you target that message, but you can more authentically develop coordinated campaigns. So somebody is getting a targeted piece of misinformation, and there may also be ads generated that reinforce that misinformation. They may be seeing it on other platforms too, all of which together undermine our information environment in worrying ways.
All right, so that's some of the worst case scary stuff. Can we have some positive? Like when you look at these emerging technologies, what are the positive things that this might do for our democracy?
So voice is important, right? And finding new ways for people to express themselves and to create content is valuable. We need to be careful about the guardrails, but I think about this very benign application. I have an 8-year-old son who loves using generative AI to create images for fun, to illustrate his stories. You can think about campaigns starting to use generative tools to improve the quality of their materials, right? So as the resource enhancer, efficiency enhancer, kind of the productivity tool, that I think is the best case scenario for those. Mm-hmm. Of course, we need to make sure that they're used responsibly, that doesn't go into a position of using manipulated images to misrepresent your opponent. Right. But when you think about the basics of campaign literature for your average person running for a local office without a big budget, there are real benefits there that can help them.
Sure.
I'm glad you're bringing up both, because my mantra going into next year is to panic responsibly.
Right.
I have to show the shirt. But for me, like, I also look at this for how AI can be used for content moderation, for detecting this type of content, for even being able, not even AI generated content, but harmful content overall. AI can continue to help speed up those processes for many of these companies.
Mm-hmm. So let's get a little bit into, you mentioned that this is a big year for elections all over the globe. We're going to spend a lot of time, I think, 11 minutes, talking about US and what's happening here. But there's interesting things happening overseas. You mentioned India and what's going on with Modi. How is approach to AI in other countries, not just them maybe being negative actors, but how will the vote and how other countries are approaching AI themselves, how is that going to affect what's happening here?
Well, I think that you'll see a lot of these countries be looking to what is happening in the United States and potentially copying some of those tactics in their own elections, and maybe also vice versa of what happens. Many of these countries are also potentially passing regulation on it. The EU is looking at that, other places as well. India, as you mentioned, they want social media companies to have to take down deep fakes after 24 hours. Or within 24 hours. There's a concern, though, that could be used to silence opposition voices, and what that might look like. And depending upon how all these other countries handle this, platforms might choose to take action for the entire globe rather than just doing it in a single individual country. And so I kind of use the metaphor of a kaleidoscope for next year, because there's so many bits and pieces that could play off of one another and could impact one another as we go through that entire year, that it's even kind of hard to paint the picture because there's so many different options of what could happen.
Mm-hmm. So should we be raising alarm bells? I mean, you're talking about panicking responsibly. Alexandra, we have members of Congress who showed up here today. There's a lot of congressional staffers who've been in the audience. What should our message be to them? Where do they need to take action right now? What's our first steps?
So on the elections piece, I will actually say, usually I'm a proponent saying, Congress, you need to act immediately. On this one, Congress needs to be paying attention, but the election season is upon us right now. So I actually think that cannot be a distraction from the very real actions that we need to see by companies, which I think hopefully we'll talk about on the stage today. That said, Congress still plays an important role, raising awareness about harms, looking at what our campaign finance laws should apply to the appropriate uses and speech and conduct of candidates for political office, which is kind of one point in the ecosystem. So I do think that there's work here, and Senator Klobuchar and others have introduced legislation on these topics that's hugely important. And the Federal Elections Commission is considering potentially opening a proceeding. But to pull back to that bigger point, the legislation is valuable. But really what we need to see now is leadership from a couple different players in the ecosystem. What's interesting is that Katie was talking about the distribution of mis and disinformation and targeted ads, which actually is sometimes different than the generative AI conversation. You know, the models that are allowing people to create manipulated images, allowing people to create manipulated text. Sometimes there's overlap, but sometimes it's a distinct set than the places where that mis and disinformation is actually being spread. And one of the things I think is essential in this conversation is that we talk not just about what should be the rules on what DALL-E can and can't generate. That gets complicated and runs into the First Amendment pretty quickly. But the most important thing is how is that information being disseminated and distributed, and how much of the platform is paying attention. And the reality is we're at a moment where many of the social media companies are scaling back their investments in their trust and safety teams. We've seen a significant scale back from the actions that kind of came after 2016 and 2020. And there is a culture right now of really strong political scrutiny and targeting of some of the independent researchers and independent actors that study this field and help raise the alarm bell to counter mis and disinformation. There are congressional investigations, there's litigation, all of which is having a significant chilling effect on that ecosystem. So we need to think about this in a robust way where legislation is a piece of the puzzle, but also letting people do their jobs in trust and safety is a really critical component as well.
If I can add 2 points to that. One is it's not just the legacy companies that are having to deal with this. There are many newer companies who have not had to build up these policies and these tools. And how trust and safety works in AI is different questions than it is than maybe what the social media platforms have had to do before. For instance, for AI, do you allow people to search, for instance, tell me all of the candidates' positions for president on abortion? That to me seems like it could be a really helpful thing for me rather than having to go to every single one of their sites. Well, what if they might get that wrong? What if it doesn't pull it on all the right stuff? Do you just not allow that altogether? How do you define that? Those are some of the things that I think we need to be thinking about as well and understanding. The second point I just want to make is that the distribution of this content is not just online. It is offline as well. These ads can appear on broadcast, on cable, in newspapers, on radio. And so we need to be thinking about this as sort of a whole of information ecosystem approach and not just be thinking about how it's distributed on online platforms.
The point about having these new companies, new entrants have to deal with trust and safety norms, I think is really critical. Because we're starting to see, so many of us have been putting public pressure on members of Congress too, to say, you know, to OpenAI and to others, what are you doing about this? And we're starting to see some of them release election policies around usage, around content that can and can't be generated. So some, for example, will say an image of a current political figure cannot be manipulated on their service. Others will say, if it looks like you are using our service to create targeted content, targeted political ads based on demographic information, that's not a permitted usage. That's important, but right now they're scrambling very fast to write those. And not doing it, I would argue, with the same level of depth and rigor that has happened, matured over the years in the field of social media platforms having to do that. So there is a field of trust and safety professionals now who think about what those disclosures should look like. There's a process for multi-stakeholder input on what your usage policy or your content policies should be. There's transparency reporting where, you know, we have demanded over the years that companies publicly disclose how their usage and content policies are enforced. The generative AI companies have to be on a really fast learning curve to pick up and adopt all of those best practices and hopefully get it better than we've seen the social media companies do so far.
So I'm going to take questions from the audience in a second, so get your questions ready. But before we get to that, it seems to me that a lot of what we're talking about here deals with the fundamental issue of having an educated electorate. You know, we're talking about misinformation. One of the best ways to combat misinformation is to have voters who understand, oh, this is an AI that's texting me, or like that really can perceive what's going on around them. So I guess this gets to the question of how can we do better to educate people about AI and misinformation? What do we need to do?
So I'm going to give you a yes and, which is that educating the public matters. We cannot let ourselves off the hook by saying that that is the answer. It's the same way that we can't say, well, there are privacy policies and people, you know, they consent when they click, you know, I accept. Users are not empowered to actually navigate this environment in the current landscape. So yes, of course, we need civics education. We need it from, you know, K all the way through to adults and, you know, family members and all of the things. But at the same time, we need to think about other ways to boost trusted sources of information. So we need trust and safety teams doing their job. We also need election officials empowered and resourced to boost authoritative sources of information when it comes to elections. So for example, there was a big movement to make sure that information about where your polling location is, where you can vote, that your poll is still open, is surfaced on the major social media companies. We have to make sure that the generative AI companies are surfacing that information and going to credible sources too. We have to train election officials to pre-bunk information, to know, create themselves as authentic, trusted voices in the space so that reporters and the public know to go to them. There's some really low-hanging fruit here, and I think particularly given staffers in the audience, it's useful underscoring it. My organization, CDT, did a research study and found that only 1 in 4 election officials are using .gov as their domain. And that matters, right? Because not just anyone can get a .gov domain. It shows that it's trusted. It shows that it's a real source of information. But places are still, referring like springfieldvotes.com to get your official information about voting in Springfield. That's just an example. Or not even, that's a hypothetical. But so there's low-hanging fruit like that we could go for too, to really make sure that people know what those trusted sources of information are, to help a little bit in this kind of confusing landscape.
I also think there's a role for media and other influencers. I'm very nervous about just the impact of the narrative of what AI could do. So your question about what's the most horrible thing. That's the most horrible thing I can dream up. It's not necessarily that it's going to come true. And so I think that we should be, again, concerned and watching and thinking about these things, because we didn't do that with social media when it first came out. So I'm very glad we're having these conversations now. But even just having that can sow distrust in the public about what the impact of AI could be on the electoral process and what happens and things of that nature. And so how do we better help them to understand the signal from the noise of what is actually happening versus what could happen?
Well, we're almost out of time, but I did say I was going to take a question from the audience, so if there's a quick one. I think I saw the gentleman's hand go up first.
Thank you. There's been a lot of talk on some of the engagement that social media, that AI can create, the personalized, targeted content, et cetera. Social media companies and ad-based companies have an incentive to increase engagement, which could lead to some bad outcomes. What should those companies, trust and safety departments, but also what should the public and other sectors do to counteract that misaligned incentive?
Oh my gosh, that's like the bajillion-dollar question that I think we've all been asking ourselves for quite some time. I do think you are seeing, one thing is that you are seeing different platforms try out different models of what this looks like with engagement versus not, different design models. And I don't know how much we'll see before we go into 2024, but I think more questions around, I keep going back to transparency and oversight. We still don't have a full picture of what is exactly happening on all these platforms, which is why transparency is important for researchers, for us to understand that. And then nobody likes the thought of the companies being in charge or the government, of any one entity being in charge. So how do we keep building out a system of checks and balances to make sure that we are holding each other accountable for the decisions that we're making? And I think, again, none of this is going to happen in the next year, but that's where I would like to see more and more of the conversation go as we think about this.
And pass the federal privacy law.
There you go. Well, thank you both so much for your time. We'll leave it with that. Thank you.
And now, our final speaker of the morning, Dr. Laurie Locasio, Undersecretary of Commerce for Standards and Technology and Director of the National Institute of Standards and Technology. She is joined in this closing conversation by Ben Powers.
Director, thank you so much for being here.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you.
So I know myself and other tech reporters, we're big fans of NIST, but for folks in the audience that may be less familiar, give us NIST's elevator pitch.
Yeah, so, NIST, don't you hate when people start with a mission statement? But I'm just going to say it's a great mission statement. It's really to promote U.S. innovation and industrial competitiveness. And we've been in that business for over 100 years, really trying to make sure that the U.S. can compete in the global economy, which, as we know, is getting more and more complex, and really important that there are agencies out there who can do that, can really support our success in that realm.
And I was going to say, the only thing worse than starting with a mission statement is starting with an acronym, which I did. So we're even, but that's the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And I know NIST really doesn't think about itself as a regulator, but you do have a key role in what a regulation eventually becomes. Could you give me a bit of a brief overview of the NIST to regulation pipeline?
Yeah, so first of all, we're a science and technology agency. And the way that we do our work is we have very deep technical research that goes on in the organization. For instance, we've been doing research in AI for decades, really. And what that leads to is really an informed guidelines, and then that feeds into standards, which then feed into regulation. So I noticed this said the road to regulation. It really is the road to responsible regulation. That's really science-backed regulation.
And thinking about that, obviously, you all have come up a lot in conversations around AI.
Oh, but I need to say we are non-regulatory.
Exactly.
Let me just make sure that's
on the
very
record.
clear. Non-regulatory. So.
But your profile has been raised. Y'all are playing a key role in the executive AI order, among other things. How have you all been grappling with that? Maybe the increased attention that's come with this.
Yeah. So I think the increased attention is fine. I'll just say, when we get a job, we get it done. I really, truly mean that. And so we have been given some very heavy lifts through the years as new problems arise within the science and technology realm, and they're always going to arise, right? Because we are always going to have cutting edge technologies. We're always going to have breakthroughs in that kind of technology. And at that point, an agency like NIST is really ready and poised to jump in and try to help assure trust in that technology. And that's why this sort of long game that we play of deep technical research that can lend itself to responsible standards is really important. We do look out at the horizon, and therefore, when something comes our way like this, it seems like, oh my gosh, all of a sudden a big thing plopped into your lap, but I can honestly say that we have been preparing for this for decades, and we are ready to take it on.
It is a bit of a double-edged sword, though. My colleague Eric Geller wrote a story just recently about NIST being underfunded and understaffed, particularly given the scope of the executive order. I'd be curious to get your reaction to that. Congressman Beyer had similar things and said he wished that he could fund you all. So, what are your reactions there, and what does that situation look like on the ground?
Yeah, so I would say that we operate as a very lean and mean organization. I don't mean mean in a bad way, lean and mean, right? So we're small but mighty. Maybe that's better.
There we go.
And we do really tend to work. So I heard Representative Beyer say that we have 2 people. When he visited, we did have 2 people, and we've expanded on that greatly just since he visited us in the summer. We now have about 30 people working full time on this program. We were preparing and mapping out what this could look like in response to a potential executive order, and so we have been hiring. But I'll also say that NIST works by amplifying our resources against other agencies, against the private sector, against public sector. So we really do tend to not just take everything into a box and say, okay, NIST has this job, we're going to do it in a vacuum and we're going to do it all by ourselves. It's just not the way we work. We leverage the dollars that we're given against, and we have some really great, brilliant people working on this, with the other great minds in the United States working on this. And together, that's a big amplification factor. I heard earlier there was a mention of AI RMF, the risk management framework. And I'll just say that that's how we accomplished the AI risk management framework. We did have a very, very small team
to create a document with outsized impact. And that's because we are a trusted member of the community. We're trusted by industry and academia and the public and private sector writ large. And we asked them for their honest input. And we had hundreds of organizations feeding into that process all along the way. We really listened. As a matter of fact, several times people said, you're really taking our feedback. We didn't take we took every bit of feedback and we responded to it. And then we made the best possible document for the United States. And because of that process, the way we brought people together, we listened, we built community. When that was released, the uptake of that was really rapid, and the acceptance of that was really rapid. And so I'll just say that that's sort of an example of how we leverage partnership very, very closely in our work.
And I think it's worth pointing out that that framework development took over about 2 years.
It did.
Which was before we had this fascination and public fascination
Right.
with generative AI, which again shows that AI has been around for a long time, actually.
Yeah.
It's not just something that sprung out of the earth,
Right.
potentially a year ago with ChatGPT. And so kind of looking through the AI executive order, and then I kind of want to turn it over to a couple questions from the audience.
Sure.
What stuck out to you most maybe is where NIST can have a really tangible impact, particularly given looming events on the horizon.
Yeah, so I'll say that we have been, there are multiple things in that executive order that NIST is responsible for. One is, and I'll just tie this into the AI RMF, one is to map AI RMF against the risks associated with generative AI. And we were prepared for that as well because in the summer, we launched the public working group on generative AI. Thousands of people signed up for that public working group. That's great. So we got the community together early in the summer. This was before the executive order, clearly. And that group has been working on thinking about how the AI risk management framework can be used to assure the responsible use of generative AI. So that's just one example of, I think a big part of the EO that we were really ready for and prepared for. There are many things. I've heard many people talk about elections. We're going to be working on content provenance. Really, the EO deals with or asks NIST to help create with the community the guidelines, the standards that can assure trusted AI or trustworthiness of AI systems. And that means safe and secure and reliable.
And I want to just go and drill down on one thing. When you talk about the provenance of content in elections, could you talk about what that would look like, maybe in practice? NIST is not necessarily a political organization or anything like that, so I think you bring a unique approach when thinking about what that looks like.
It's the way we approach everything, which is really to make sure that we have the right technical approach that people can know will guarantee that the way that they're using that. Let me back up. I'll just say that the work that we do is to provide these technical guidelines that are science-backed and technically backed, right? And so we would approach the measurement of content provenance with deep scientific and technical research and backing from the community to understand how other people are using it, how other people are approaching it, bring it all together and come up with the best possible solution that we can all implement as quickly as possible.
And so I think we have time for one brief question. Anybody out here in the audience got one? There in the back.
Hello, thank you so much. I know this is a lot to ask for, but it is an unanswered question after listening to everyone. So we're thinking about reliability, we're thinking about trust, but is there any, are you working or partnering with any agencies on sustainability, given that as AI advances, it's going to increase data consumption, and that plays a role in climate impacts. So I'm just curious about that. I know this is all kind of at the cusp of everything, but just wondering about that.
Yeah, so I appreciate that question. What our approach is going to be. So first of all, we're working on the horizontal to really look at technical characteristics and socio-technical characteristics, because there's the human involved, right, with the technology here, that can really cut across all sectors and all areas of research, and really across all industries. But the other thing that we're doing is looking at the vertical, like where is AI applied, and how do you assure the responsible use of AI in various sectors. So yeah, we are doing that. We're mapping it onto various sectors and areas, and that will be a part of the work that of NIST going forward. Thank you for that question. Appreciate it.
All right, and that's the time we have. Thank you so much again, Director.
Thank you.
And now to close us out, please welcome back David Ewalt, the Messenger Science and Technology Editor.
Well, thank you so much to everyone attending, all of our amazing speakers, to the editors and reporters who made this all happen, and to all of you who joined us here, but also online. There's a lot of people watching the stream right now. I really appreciate your engagement. We would also like to thank our sponsor, Seeker, for their support of today's program. We really appreciate their involvement here. One thing I hope everybody noticed is how much AI technology was actually a part of today's event. Actually, it's so good right now that you may not have noticed, but the voice of God that just introduced me and every speaker, that was an AI model. Our creative in the background was all created by AI. Hopefully those of you who are in person had a chance to check out the Seed AI art installation. So we had AI powering every minute of this event just as we were all talking about it. There are some key takeaways I wanted to share just before we all get out of here. Just some things we learned I thought was interesting. We started off on a bit of a scary note. We learned from DARPA's Kathleen Fisher that the concentration of big AI players makes for obvious cybersecurity targets. She told us everyone needs to make a plan ahead of time and said, when you're terrorized, you don't think quickly. I think that is a sound bit of advice. We learned from BSA's Victoria Espinel that time is running out to implement policies that will protect us from AI's harms. The moment we have now is not going to last forever, she said. There's 6 to 12 months to seize this opportunity. But it is an enormous opportunity, she said. We finally have policymakers around the world sincerely focused on this. We learned from Representative Obernolte that the Defense Production Act might not be the best tool to get companies to act responsibly on AI security, and that Congress does have to act. We learned from Katie Horvath and Alexandra Reed Givens that it's time to panic responsibly about how AI is going to affect the upcoming elections. We learned that the SEC chair thinks it's possible AI could cause a flash crash in the markets. Chairman Gensler said that the herding effect could drive us off an inadvertent cliff, but he also warned that it's not just AI is the problem. Fraud is fraud, he said. There's a human somewhere that's using that AI model to defraud the public, and he warned that that person is going to hear from the SEC. EqualAI's Miriam Vogel warned us that it's going to take a long time for the courts to resolve key issues around AI like copyright, so legislators and businesses involved can't wait for the court to figure things out. We have to move on our own. And finally, we learned that we all should be playing Fortnite. Barbara Humpton, the CEO of Siemens, said that her advice to parents managing kids is, I tell them, let them play games with their kids. It introduces them to technology at an early age. It helps the parents understand what's going on. And I think that's one of our key takeaways from this event in general, is that being involved with the AI revolution, that using these tools and understanding them and helping those around you understand them well is one of the keys to success and protecting our future. So thank you all again for coming. We hope that today's discussions bring us a little closer to finding that perfect balance between regulation and innovation. Before you head out, don't forget to scan the QR codes to subscribe to our newsletter, and we hope you will follow us on social at The Messenger for breaking news, exclusive scoops, and expert insights on AI policy, and a lot more. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.